This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. As I made my way to the elevator, I noticed how run down everything looked. The carpet was worn and stained. The wallpaper was peeling in places. It definitely didn't match the pictures I'd seen online when booking, but I figured it was just an old hotel in need of renovations. The real weirdness started when I got to my room. Taped to the back of the door was a handwritten list of rules. At first, I thought it was just the usual stuff about checkout times and not smoking. But as I read through it, my stomach dropped. Do not answer the phone at 4:14 a.m. Do not leave your room between 1 and 4 a.m. for any reason. Do not make eye contact with the maid in red. If you hear knocking, do not open the door unless you are certain of who is there. Leave the TV on at all times, even when sleeping. Do not look out the window after midnight. What the hell kind of rules were these? I immediately wanted to go back downstairs and demand a different room, or better yet, a refund so I could find another hotel. But it was late, I was exhausted, and I had an early meeting the next day. I decided to just try to ignore the creepy rules and get some sleep. Big mistake. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was coming from the hallway, but as I became more alert, I realized it was coming from the window, which made no sense since I was on the 4th floor. I lay there frozen, listening to the rhythmic tapping grow louder. Every instinct told me not to look, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly turned my head toward the window and nearly screamed. There was a man outside, pressed up against the glass, but he didn't look human. His skin was a sickly gray color, and his eyes were completely black. He was grinning at me with rotted teeth as he tapped on the window with long, bony fingers. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a dream. When I opened them again, he was gone. But the tapping had moved to my door. I wanted nothing more than to run out of that room. But I remembered the rule about not leaving between 1 and 4 a.m., so I huddled under the covers, shaking, as the tapping continued for what felt like hours. When my alarm went off at 7, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept a wink after the window incident. I seriously considered just packing up and leaving, conference be damned. But I told myself I was being silly, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in an unfamiliar place. I went through my meetings in a daze, jumping at every sudden noise. By the time I got back to the hotel that evening, I had almost convinced myself that nothing weird had happened. Maybe I'd just had a really vivid nightmare. I stopped by the front desk to ask about switching rooms, making up an excuse about a leaky faucet. But the clerk just stared at me blankly and said there were no other rooms available. So I reluctantly made my way back up to 415. As I was unlocking my door, I heard a child's voice coming from down the hall. "Help me, please, I'm lost." I turned to see a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing near the ice machine. She was wearing an old-fashioned nightgown, and her long, dark hair obscured most of her face. "Hey, sweetie, are you okay? Where are your parents?" I asked, taking a step toward her. She lifted her head, and I gasped. Where her eyes should have been were just empty, black sockets. "Help me!" she wailed again, in a voice that no longer sounded human. I dove into my room and slammed the door, my heart pounding. What the hell was going on in this place? I tried calling the front desk, but the phone just rang and rang with no answer. My cell phone showed no service. I was trapped. I paced the room, trying to calm down and think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation for all this. Maybe I was having some kind of mental breakdown from stress. Or maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. As I was pondering my options, my eyes fell on the painting hanging over the bed. It was a portrait of a woman in Victorian-era clothing. Something about her expression made me uneasy. I could have sworn her eyes were looking in a different direction than they had been earlier. I quickly looked away, remembering the rule about not making eye contact. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the painting was watching me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror. Strange noises kept me on edge. Whispers from the air vent, footsteps in the hall that stopped right outside my door, the sound of nails scraping against the walls. I kept the TV on like the rules said, but every so often the picture would dissolve into static. In the white noise, I could almost make out faces screaming silently. At 4:13 a.m. the phone rang. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the receiver. The rules said not to answer at 4:14. Was it safe 1 minute earlier? I decided not to risk it. I let it ring until it stopped, right as the clock changed to 4:14. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like something was waiting, watching to see if I would break the rules. When my alarm went off at 7, I'd never been so relieved to see daylight. I threw my things in my suitcase, not even bothering to shower or change. I just wanted out of that nightmare hotel. As I was rushing toward the elevator, I saw a maid coming out of the room next door. She was wearing a red uniform. I quickly averted my eyes, remembering the rule. But as the elevator doors were closing, I couldn't help but glance back. The maid was standing right outside my room now, staring directly at me. Her face was chalk white, and her eyes were solid black, just like the man at the window. She smiled, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The doors shut, and I collapsed against the wall, shaking. What had I done? The rules said not to make eye contact with the maid in red. Would she come after me now? I ran out of the hotel and didn't stop until I was in a cab headed for the airport. I called my boss and told her I had a family emergency and had to leave the conference early. It's been a week now, and I'm still jumping at every shadow. I keep expecting to see that maid's terrifying face grinning at me from dark corners. I've tried researching the Gateway Hotel online, but I can't find any record of it existing. The confirmation email I got when I booked has disappeared from my inbox. I don't know what to think. Was it all just an extremely vivid nightmare? Am I losing my mind? Or did I stumble into some kind of portal to hell disguised as a corporate hotel? All I know is that I'm never traveling for work again, and I'm sleeping with the lights on for the foreseeable future. I can't shake the feeling that by looking at that maid, I opened a door that can't be closed. I just pray that whatever is on the other side stays there and doesn't follow me home. I never thought I'd end up in a situation like this. Hell, a few months ago I was just another burnt-out city dweller, drowning in stress and desperately seeking an escape. That's what led me to buy that remote cabin in Alaska. I wanted isolation, peace, a chance to reset my life. I had no idea what I was really getting myself into. The cabin seemed perfect when I first arrived. Nestled in the wilderness, hours from the nearest town, it was exactly the kind of quiet retreat I'd been dreaming of. Sure, it was a bit run down, but I figured that just added to the rustic charm. I spent those first few days settling in, chopping firewood, getting familiar with the generator, and generally just enjoying the solitude. My only neighbor for miles was a guy named Steve, who lived about a mile down the road. He seemed friendly enough when he stopped by to introduce himself, offering to help me out if I needed anything. I was grateful to have someone nearby who knew the area, even if I'd come here to get away from people. It wasn't until about a week in that things started to get weird. I was exploring the cabin, poking around in drawers and closets, when I found an old leather-bound journal tucked away. The name inside read Will Lenning, presumably the previous owner. Curious, I started flipping through it. At first it was just mundane stuff, notes about maintaining the cabin, observations about local wildlife. But as I got further in, the entries took a disturbing turn. Will wrote about seeing strange things in the woods, catching glimpses of what he called the twisted man. He described this entity as unnaturally tall and thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. I tried to brush it off as the ramblings of someone suffering from cabin fever. But something about those frantic scribbled passages sent a chill down my spine. That night, I found myself peering out the windows into the darkness, imagining twisted shapes in the shadows. Over the next few days, I started noticing odd things. Objects would be in different places than where I'd left them. I'd hear creaking footsteps when I was sure I was alone. Once I could have sworn I saw a flash of movement outside, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me just like it had gotten to Will. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. What if there really was something out there? Things escalated about 2 weeks in. I was watching an old DVD I'd brought with me when the TV suddenly cut to static. Through the snowy interference, I could make out what looked like words forming. He is not who he seems. It only lasted for a split second before the movie resumed. I sat there in shock, trying to process what I'd seen. Was I hallucinating? Going crazy? Or was something trying to warn me? The incident left me shaken. I found myself jumping at every sound, constantly looking over my shoulder. Sleep became almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that twisted man from Will's journal lurking just outside. A few nights later, I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. Something felt off. The cabin was dead silent, but I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bedroom doorway. There it was, an impossibly tall, emaciated figure, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, just like Will had described. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, too terrified to move. When morning finally came, I seriously considered packing up and getting the hell out of there. But something made me stay. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe some part of me needed to understand what was happening. I decided to talk to Steve, see if he knew anything about the cabin's history or Will Lenning. When I went over to his place, though, something felt wrong. His friendly demeanor seemed forced, almost manic, and I could have sworn I saw dark stains on his floor that looked suspiciously like blood. As I was leaving, a glint of metal caught my eye. Partially hidden under Steve's porch was what looked like a human femur. My blood ran cold as I hurried back to my cabin, my mind racing. Was Steve involved in something sinister? Was he the reason for the warning on my TV? That night, I heard a vehicle pulling up outside. Peering out the window, I saw Steve's truck. He got out holding something long and metallic, a rifle. Panic seized me as I realized he was coming to kill me. I scrambled to find a weapon, anything to defend myself. As Steve burst through the door, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The twisted man materialized, its impossible form interposing itself between me and Steve. Steve's eyes widened in terror. He fired wildly, the sound deafening in the small cabin. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder as one of the bullets found its mark. Adrenaline surging, I managed to grab a heavy cast-iron skillet. As Steve turned to flee, I swung with all my might, catching him in the back of the head. He crumpled to the floor, motionless. Breathing heavily, I looked up. The twisted man was gone. Had I imagined it? No, without its intervention, I'd surely be dead. Somehow the very thing I'd feared had saved my life. With shaking hands, I checked Steve's pulse. Nothing. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. I'd killed a man, but it had been him or me. As the adrenaline faded, the pain in my shoulder intensified. I knew I needed medical attention, but I was hours from help. Gritting my teeth, I did my best to bandage the wound. I spent that night in a daze, trying to process everything. The entity I'd feared, the twisted man, had protected me. The neighbor I'd trusted had tried to murder me. Nothing made sense anymore. When morning came, I knew I couldn't stay. With my injury and the trauma of what had happened, surviving alone out here was no longer an option. I packed what I could and began the long journey back to civilization. As I took one last look at the cabin, I caught a glimpse of that twisted figure in the trees. But this time, I felt no fear, only a profound sense of gratitude. It nodded once, then melted back into the forest. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened out there in the Alaskan wilderness. Was the twisted man some kind of guardian spirit, a product of my stressed mind? I may never know for sure, but the experience changed me profoundly. I learned that things are rarely what they seem on the surface, and that sometimes our deepest fears can become our greatest allies. I'm back in the city now, my shoulder slowly healing, but I know I'll never be the same. Those weeks in the cabin stripped away my old self, forcing me to confront the darkness both around and within me. And in that confrontation, I found a strength I never knew I had. Sometimes I still see twisted shapes in the shadows, or hear impossible whispers on the wind. But now, instead of fear, I feel a strange comfort, a reminder that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding, and that light can be found in the most unexpected places. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll face it with new eyes. The Alaskan wilderness may have nearly killed me, but in a way, it also gave me new life. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Recently moved into a new apartment in a part of town I'd never been to before. It was a bit of a rushed decision. I needed a place fast after a bad breakup, and this was the only affordable option I could find on short notice. The neighborhood seemed a little run down and sketchy, but I figured it would be fine for a temporary situation until I could find something better. The first thing I noticed when I moved in was how young everyone in the building seemed to be. I'm 26, and I don't think I saw a single resident over 30. It gave the place a kind of college dorm vibe, which was kind of nice, but also a little odd for an apartment complex. My new neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. There was May across the hall, Gianna next door, and Will and Matteo a floor below. They all welcomed me warmly and offered to show me around. I was grateful for the company, since I didn't know anyone else in the area. It was on my third night there that things started to get weird. I was up late unpacking when I heard a commotion outside. Looking out my window, I saw my neighbors all gathered on the street, staring at something. Curious, I threw on some shoes and headed down to see what was going on. As I approached the group, I saw what had caught their attention. An elderly man lying in the middle of the road, writhing in apparent agony. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and he was moaning pitifully. My first instinct was to rush over and help him, but May grabbed my arm to stop me. "Don't," she said sharply. "We don't interfere, ever." I was confused and alarmed. "What do you mean? That man clearly needs help. We need to call an ambulance or something." Will shook his head grimly. "Trust us. It's better if we don't get involved. Just watch." Reluctantly, I stood with the group and observed the bizarre scene. For nearly an hour, the old man thrashed and cried out, begging for help. It was agonizing to watch. But true to their word, none of my neighbors made a move to assist him. Eventually, the man went still and silent. A moment later, he simply vanished into thin air, as if he'd never been there at all. I blinked in shock, certain I must have imagined it, but the grim expressions on my neighbors' faces told me they'd seen it too. What just happened?" I stammered. Gianna sighed. "Welcome to the neighborhood. This is what we deal with every night." Over the next few days, my neighbors filled me in on the strange phenomenon that plagued our street. Every single night without fail, some kind of apparition would appear. Sometimes an elderly person, sometimes a child, always in extreme distress. But they weren't real people. If you tried to interact with them in any way, you'd disappear too. "How do you know that?" I asked. "Has anyone actually tried?" A pained look crossed Will's face. "My girlfriend Shannon," he said quietly. "About 6 months ago. She couldn't stand to watch anymore and ran out to help what looked like an injured little girl. She vanished right before our eyes. I haven't seen her since." I was horrified. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Did you report it to the police?" Will laughed bitterly. "Of course, but they didn't believe us. No evidence, no body, nothing. They decided she must have run away." "Why don't you all just move?" I asked. "This is insane." "We've tried," Matteo explained, "but something always goes wrong. Apartments fall through, job offers get rescinded. It's like we're trapped here." I tried to process all this information. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as some kind of shared delusion or elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew they were telling the truth. I'd seen that old man disappear with my own eyes. For the next week, I watched in horrified fascination as the nightly visitations continued. A woman with her throat slit, gasping for air. A man with horrific burns covering his body. A child missing limbs, crawling across the pavement. Each time, my neighbors and I would gather to bear silent witness, never intervening no matter how heart-wrenching the scene. I barely slept, jumping at every sound and shadow. During the day, I tried to go about my normal routine, but I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. How could I possibly live like this? On the 8th night since I'd moved in, things took an even darker turn. We were all outside as usual, watching a particularly gruesome apparition of what appeared to be a car crash victim. Suddenly, Will let out a strangled cry. "Shannon! Oh my God, it's Shannon!" I squinted at the figure on the ground. It did resemble a young woman, but she was so mangled and bloody, it was hard to make out any distinct features. Before anyone could stop him, Will bolted towards the apparition. "Shannon, I'm coming, baby, hold on." "Will, no!" Gianna screamed. But it was too late. As soon as Will touched the figure, there was a blinding flash of red light. When my vision cleared, both Will and the apparition were gone. In their place was a sleek black vehicle I'd never seen before, its crimson running lights pulsing ominously. We all stood frozen in shock and terror. After a moment, the vehicle's engine roared to life, and it sped off into the night, leaving no trace behind. Matteo was the first to break the silence. Fuck. We told him. We fucking told him not to." May burst into tears. Gianna just stared blankly at the spot where Will had vanished. I felt like I was going to be sick. This was too much. Whatever was going on here, I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I turned and ran back to my apartment, slamming and locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in a panicked haze, throwing my belongings haphazardly into suitcases. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I knew I couldn't stay here another night. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek through my window, I heard a soft knock at my door. Cautiously, I opened it to find Gianna standing there, looking exhausted and haunted. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "I have to. I'm sorry, but I can't live like this. I don't understand what's happening here, and I don't want to." Gianna gave me a sad smile. "I don't blame you. I hope you make it out. Maybe you can find help for the rest of us somehow." "I'll try," I promised, though I had no idea how I could possibly explain any of this to authorities. I finished packing quickly and called a taxi. As I waited outside with my bags, I took one last look at the eerily quiet street. In the light of day, it was hard to believe the horrors I'd witnessed here. Part of me still wondered if it had all been some kind of shared hallucination. But then I thought of Will and the haunted looks in my neighbor's eyes, and I knew it had all been terrifyingly real. As my taxi pulled up, I sent up a silent prayer for the friends I was leaving behind, trapped in this nightmare they couldn't escape. I don't know if I'll ever understand what I experienced in that place. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all a bad dream, but in my darkest moments, I find myself scanning the streets, half expecting to see a mutilated figure begging for help. And I wonder, if I ever do see such a thing again, will I be able to resist the urge to help? I got ready and headed over around 8 p.m. May's apartment was already buzzing with people when I arrived. She greeted me warmly at the door with a big smile and ushered me inside. "Arden, I'm so glad you could make it," she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug. I was a bit taken aback by her enthusiasm, but chalked it up to birthday excitement. As the night went on, I mingled with the other guests and had a few drinks. May kept finding excuses to come talk to me, touching my arm or laughing a bit too hard at my lame jokes. I started to get the sense that maybe she was interested in me as more than just a neighbor. The thought made me a bit nervous. I hadn't dated anyone in a while and wasn't sure how I felt about May yet. Around midnight, most of the guests had left, and it was just a small group of us remaining. May suggested we all head to a nearby bar to continue the celebration. "Come on, the night's still young," she insisted. I was feeling pretty buzzed at that point and agreed to tag along. The bar was dimly lit and had a slightly seedy vibe, but the drinks were cheap. We crowded around a small table in the corner. May sat next to me, her leg pressed against mine under the table. I could feel the warmth of her skin through my jeans. She leaned in close to be heard over the music. "I'm really glad you came out tonight," she said, her breath hot on my ear. A shiver ran down my spine. After another round of shots, May grabbed my hand. "Come with me. I want to show you something," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. Before I could respond, she was pulling me toward the back of the bar. We weaved through the crowd until we reached a door marked "Employees Only." May glanced around quickly before pushing it open and yanking me inside. We were in some kind of small dressing room or storage area. Racks of costumes lined the walls, and a vanity with a large mirror took up one corner. May shut the door behind us, muffling the noise from the bar. My heart was pounding. What was she up to? "I've been wanting to get you alone all night," May purred, stepping closer to me. Her eyes were dark with desire. Before I could react, She pressed her body against mine and kissed me hard on the lips. I froze for a moment in shock before melting into the kiss. Her lips were soft and tasted like cherry lip gloss. My head was spinning. From the alcohol or the kiss, I wasn't sure. We broke apart, both breathing heavily. "Wow," I managed to say. May grinned and started to lean in again when suddenly the lights flickered. We both looked up, startled. "That's weird," May muttered. Then the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I could see my breath forming little clouds in the air. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Something felt very, very wrong. "We should get out of here," I said, grabbing May's hand. But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. It was like it was sealed shut. May started to look panicked. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from behind us. We slowly turned around, clinging to each other. In the mirror of the vanity, I saw a dark shape forming. It was like a void of pure darkness, vaguely humanoid, but constantly shifting and writhing. Two glowing red eyes appeared in the inky blackness. May screamed, and I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, but I could feel the malevolent energy radiating from the thing in waves. It felt ancient and evil. The shape started to move toward us. I pounded on the door desperately, screaming for help, but the music from the bar drowned us out. May was sobbing hysterically beside me. Just as the shadow was about to reach us, the door suddenly flew open. We tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The bartender stood there looking confused. "Everything okay in there?" he asked. I glanced back into the room, but it was empty. No sign of the terrifying shadow creature. May and I looked at each other in shock, unsure of what had just happened. Had it all been in our heads? We mumbled some excuse to the bartender and hurried out of the bar. Neither of us spoke as we walked quickly back to our apartment building. When we reached May's door, she turned to me with wide, frightened eyes. What was that thing?" she whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I think we should stay away from that bar from now on." May nodded in agreement. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, the terror of what we'd experienced battling with the lingering sexual tension from earlier. Finally, May said goodnight and disappeared into her apartment. I went back to my place and spent a sleepless night replaying the events in my mind. Part of me wanted to write it off as some kind of shared hallucination brought on by too much alcohol. But deep down, I knew what we had seen was real. In the days that followed, May and I avoided talking about what happened. Our budding romance seemed to have been snuffed out by the terrifying encounter. We went back to being just neighbors, exchanging awkward hellos in the hallway. But late at night, when the shadows grew long, I would remember those glowing red eyes, and I knew that something evil was out there, lurking in the darkness. I never went back to that bar again. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. One night, after downing way too many drinks at the local bar, I completely lost it. In a drunken rage, I smashed up the convenience store downtown, shattered windows, knocked over shelves, the whole 9 yards. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and fragments of hazy memories from the night before. When I turned on the TV and saw my own face plastered across the screen as the prime suspect, I panicked. I couldn't face the consequences of what I'd done. In that moment of desperation, I made the rash decision to run. I grabbed whatever cash I could find, threw some clothes in a bag, and took off without even saying goodbye to Mary Lynn. I drove for days, heading as far north as I could go, I ended up in this tiny town near Barrow, Alaska, about as remote as you can get in North America. It was the dead of winter, and the sun hadn't risen in weeks. The perpetual darkness felt fitting for my state of mind. Desperate for work and a place to lay low, I took a job at this old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Night shift, of course, since day and night were meaningless here anyway. The pay was decent and they didn't ask too many questions, which suited me just fine. On my first night, I met my two co-workers, this huge hulking guy everyone just called Big Fellow, and a wiry, twitchy man named Skarcheki. They were an odd pair, but seemed used to the isolation and monotony of the job. We mostly worked in silence, organizing shipments and taking inventory. The warehouse itself was massive and eerily empty. Row after row of towering shelves, most of them bare. What little inventory we did have was strange. Unmarked crates and containers, some of them emitting faint sounds or vibrations. I tried not to think too hard about what might be inside. As the weeks dragged on, I settled into a grim routine. Work all night in the warehouse, try to sleep during the day in my dingy motel room, repeat. The constant darkness started to mess with my head. I'd lose track of time, unsure if I'd been awake for hours or days. One night, about a month into the job, things took a turn for the weird. I was doing my usual rounds through the warehouse when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze in place, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. No response, just that unsettling growl again, closer this time. I turned to run back to the main office where Big Fellow and Skarcheki were, but found my path blocked. There, lurking in the shadows between two shelving units, was something. I couldn't make out its shape clearly, just a mass of writhing darkness with glowing red eyes. Terror gripped me as I stumbled backwards, knocking over a stack of crates. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek and lunged towards me. I scrambled to my feet and ran faster than I ever had in my life, weaving through the maze-like aisles of the warehouse. I burst into the office, slamming the door behind me. "There's something out there," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. Big Fellow and Skarcheki exchanged a knowing look. "You saw it too, huh?" Skarcheki said with a nervous chuckle. "Welcome to the night shift, buddy." They explained that strange occurrences were common here, especially during the darkest part of the polar night. "This place sits on some kind of convergence," Big Fellow rumbled. "Thin spot between our world and others." I thought they were messing with me at first, some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy. But as the nights wore on, I couldn't deny the otherworldly presence that permeated the warehouse, shadows that moved of their own accord, whispers in languages that didn't sound human, glimpses of creatures that defied description. We developed a system for dealing with the supernatural threats. Skarcheki was our early warning system. Seems he had a sixth sense for when things were about to get dicey. Big Fellow was our muscle, somehow able to physically grapple with beings that by all rights shouldn't have corporeal form. I mostly tried to stay out of the way and not get eaten or possessed or whatever else these things were capable of. But over time, I found myself getting pulled into the action more and more. There was a strange camaraderie that developed between the three of us, forged in the shared experience of facing the unknown night after night. One particularly harrowing night, we were cornered by a pack of shadow creatures near the loading docks. Big Fellow was trying to hold them off while Skarcheki and I scrambled to find anything we could use as a weapon. In desperation, I grabbed a can of industrial solvent and a lighter. "Get back!" I shouted, flicking the lighter and spraying a stream of flames at the encroaching shadows. They recoiled with unearthly shrieks, giving us the opening we needed to escape. As we barricaded ourselves in the office, panting and wide-eyed with leftover adrenaline, I realized something. For the first time in months, maybe years, I hadn't thought about drinking. The constant struggle against supernatural forces left no room for my old demons. Days blurred together as we continued our nightly battles against the darkness. Sometimes we'd go a week with nothing more than some spooky noises and weird vibes. Other times we'd be fighting for our lives against horrors that shouldn't exist in our reality. I lost track of how long I'd been there. Weeks, months. The outside world felt like a distant memory. My old life, my mistakes, Mary Lynn, it all seemed to belong to someone else. But reality came crashing back one night when I was restocking supplies in the office. I knocked over a stack of papers and a photo fluttered to the floor. It was a missing persons flyer, with my face on it. Seeing that image of myself, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, smiling, hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been so caught up in this surreal other world that I'd almost forgotten who I was, where I'd come from. I knew then that I couldn't hide forever. I had to face what I'd done, make amends if I could. But I also knew I couldn't just abandon Big Fellow and Scarsecki. They needed me, and if I was honest with myself, I needed them too. That night, as we fended off another incursion of otherworldly horrors, I made a decision. I would stay until we could find a replacement, someone else crazy enough to take on this insane job. Then I'd head back home, turn myself in, and try to piece my life back together. As I write this now, I'm on a bus heading south, back towards civilization, consequences, and hopefully redemption. Part of me still wonders if any of it was real. Maybe the isolation and darkness drove me mad, made me hallucinate the whole thing. But then I look at the scars on my arms from claws that should not exist. I remember the bone-deep cold of shadows that hungered. I can still hear Big Fellow's booming laugh and see Scarsecki's twitchy grin. Whatever awaits me back in the world of sunlight and normalcy, I know I'm not the same man who ran away all those months ago. I've faced darkness both within and without, and somehow came out the other side. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. If things ever get too dark again, there's a warehouse at the top of the world where the night never ends, and two of the strangest, bravest men I've ever known are holding the line against the shadows. And maybe, just maybe, they could use another set of hands. I'd been working at the remote research station for about 6 months at that point. The pay was good, and the work was interesting enough, but the isolation could really get to you after a while, especially during the polar night, when the sun doesn't rise for over 2 months straight. We all knew what we were signing up for, but you can't truly comprehend that kind of darkness until you experience it. That particular day started like any other. I woke up in my small bunk, the alarm on my phone providing the only illumination in the pitch-black room. I groggily made my way to the communal showers, following the dim emergency lights along the hallway. After getting dressed, I headed to the cafeteria for some coffee and breakfast before starting my shift. As I sat there trying to wake up, I overheard some of the other workers talking in hushed tones. Apparently, a couple of the guys who'd gone out to check on some equipment the day before hadn't returned on schedule. Search parties were being organized to go look for them once it was light out, which really just meant once the floodlights were turned on outside the main compound. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Storms could blow in quickly up here, and protocol was to shelter in place if conditions got bad. I figured they'd probably just holed up in one of the emergency shelters scattered around the area. My job that day was to do inventory and restocking in the main storage warehouse. It was tedious work, but at least the warehouse was well lit and insulated from the brutal cold outside. I spent most of the morning going through crates and checking things off on my tablet. It was around midday when the first signs of trouble started. The lights in the warehouse began to flicker ominously. At first I thought it was just a minor power fluctuation, but then they went out completely for a few seconds. My heart started racing as I was plunged into total blackness. When they came back on, I let out a sigh of relief. I tried to radio the main building to report the issue, but all I got was static. Must be some kind of electromagnetic interference, I thought. I made a mental note to mention it to the tech team later. As the day wore on, the flickering got worse and more frequent. I was starting to get seriously unnerved. During one of the longer blackouts, I could have sworn I heard scratching noises coming from the walls. But that was impossible. The warehouse walls were thick concrete and steel, designed to withstand the harshest Arctic conditions. I decided to call it quits early and head back to the main living quarters. As I was locking up, I noticed strange marks on the outside of the heavy metal door, long scratches that definitely hadn't been there that morning. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures. The short walk back to the main building was nerve-wracking. The floodlights illuminating the path between buildings seemed dimmer than usual, creating unsettling shadows at the edges of my vision. I kept thinking I saw movement in the darkness beyond the lights, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. When I finally made it inside, the atmosphere was tense. Groups of people were huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. I caught fragments about the missing search parties and reports of strange noises outside the perimeter. I headed straight for the control room to report what I'd experienced at the warehouse. As I approached, I could hear raised voices from inside. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked and entered. The station manager, a gruff older man named Johnson, was in a heated argument with the head of security. They both fell silent and turned to look at me as I walked in. "What is it?" Johnson barked. I quickly relayed what had happened, the power fluctuations, the scratching noises, the marks on the door. As I spoke, I saw the two men exchange a significant look. "You didn't see anything out there? Anything unusual?" the security chief asked carefully. I shook my head. "No, but it felt like something was watching me, following me." Johnson sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "All right, listen up. We've got a situation developing here. The search parties we sent out this morning haven't reported back. We've lost contact with 2 of our remote sensor stations, and now we're getting multiple reports of activity outside the perimeter." "What kind of activity?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. The security chief pulled up some grainy footage on one of the monitors. At first, I couldn't make out what I was looking at, just indistinct shapes moving in the darkness beyond the lights. Then one of the shapes moved into the edge of the illuminated area, and I felt my blood run cold. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Pale, hairless skin stretched over an emaciated frame. No visible ears or nose, just sunken eye sockets with pinpricks of reflected light. As it moved, I could see a network of dark veins pulsing beneath its skin. "What the hell is that thing?" I whispered. "We don't know," Johnson said grimly. "But there are more of them out there, and they seem to be drawn to the light, and to us." Just then, the lights flickered ominously. In that split second of darkness, we heard an inhuman shriek from somewhere outside. "Listen to me very carefully," Johnson said. his voice deadly serious. "These creatures, whatever they can't seem to tolerate bright light. As long as we stay in well-lit areas, we should be safe. But if the power goes out—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. We gathered everyone into the main building and fortified it as best we could. Emergency generators were fired up. Every spare light source was collected and distributed. As night fell, or rather, as the perpetual night grew even darker, the attacks began in earnest. We could hear them out there, chittering and shrieking as they threw themselves against doors and windows. The outer floodlights flickered and died one by one as the creatures somehow disabled them. Inside, we huddled together in the brightest lit areas, weapons improvised from tools clutched in sweaty hands. The security team had a few guns, but ammo was limited. We had no idea if conventional weapons would even work against these things. I'll never forget the first time one of them got inside. The lights in one of the outlying corridors had gone out, and a small team went to investigate. We heard gunshots, screams, then silence. When we went to look, there was nothing left but blood smears and drag marks leading into the darkness. The night seemed to last forever. We lost more people as the creatures found weak points in our defenses. Each time the lights flickered, my heart would race. We were burning through fuel for the generators at an alarming rate. Just when I thought we couldn't hold out much longer, we noticed the attacks growing less frequent. The shrieks from outside grew fainter, more distant, and then, miraculously, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. The sun was rising. We had survived the night. As daylight slowly returned, we ventured outside to survey the damage. There were deep gouges in the metal walls, doors torn from hinges. But of the creatures themselves, there was no sign. It was as if they had melted away with the darkness. We tried to radio for help, but all communication systems were down. It took days for a rescue team to reach us. By then, half our people were dead or missing. Those of us who survived were left with questions that haunt us to this day. What were those things? Where did they come from? And most chillingly, will they return when darkness falls again? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know one thing: I'll never take light for granted again, because now I know what horrors lurk in the dark, waiting for their chance to strike. Started off normal enough. I arrived for my 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, ready to tackle whatever came my way. Dave, the night manager, gave me a quick rundown of duties and handed me a list of rules to follow. I thought it was just standard procedure stuff, you know. Boy, was I wrong. The first few hours were quiet, just the usual late-night crowd grabbing burgers after the bars closed. But around 2 a.m., things started to get weird. This guy came through the drive-thru, and I swear to God he had no face, just a blank slate where features should be. I froze, not knowing what to do. Then I remembered Dave's rules. If someone with no face orders, give them whatever they want and don't look directly at them. My hands shaking, I handed over a Big Mac meal and watched as the faceless man drove away. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was just tired and seeing things. But then more creepy stuff started happening. A woman came in wearing a shawl, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were reptilian, slitted pupils, yellow irises. I felt my heart racing, but I remembered the rules again. The lady with the shawl always orders a filet-o-fish. Don't ask questions, just serve her quickly. So I did, and she left without incident. As the night wore on, the encounters got stranger and more terrifying. A little boy appeared in the play area, but he was translucent, like a ghost. He just stood there, staring at me with sad eyes. The rules said not to acknowledge him, so I forced myself to look away, even as I felt his gaze boring into me. Around 4 a.m., this guy named Stan came in. He seemed normal at first, but then he started getting aggressive, demanding free food and threatening me. I was scared out of my mind, but I remembered the rule. If Stan comes in, give him exactly 3 chicken nuggets, no more, no less. I don't know how, but it worked. He calmed down instantly and left, but the worst was yet to come. At 5:30 a.m., just as I thought I'd made it through the night, I heard a wet, squelching sound coming from the kitchen. I turned around and saw, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a massive, sentient hamburger, but grotesque and deformed. Meat and cheese oozed from it as it slithered across the floor towards me. I was paralyzed with fear, but then I remembered the final rule. If you see the hamburger, do not run. Stand your ground and recite the McDonald's slogan 3 times. With my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, I faced the monstrosity and stammered out, "I'm lovin' it. I'm lovin' it. I'm lovin' it." To my utter disbelief, the thing stopped, quivered for a moment, then slowly retreated back into the kitchen. When 6 a.m. finally rolled around, I was a mess, shaking, crying, barely able to stand. Dave came in for the morning shift, looking annoyingly chipper. "How was your first night?" he asked casually, like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I lost it. I started yelling at him, demanding answers about what the hell was going on in this place. He just listened calmly, then said, "Look, Blair, this is just part of the night shift. We deal with some unusual customers, but you handled it well. How about we bump your pay to $27 an hour if you stay on the night crew?" I was stunned. Part of me wanted to run screaming and never look back. But another part, well, $27 an hour is a lot for a 16-year-old, and I'd survived, hadn't I? So God help me, I agreed. It's been a few weeks now, and every night shift brings new horrors. But I'm getting used to it, I guess. The faceless drive-through guy is a regular now. The ghost boy still makes me sad, but I've learned to ignore him. And the hamburger, well, let's just say I've gotten very good at reciting that slogan. I don't know if I'll ever understand what's really going on at this McDonald's. Are these creatures from another dimension? Some kind of shared hallucination? Or is this just what happens when you work nights at a fast food joint? All I know is I'm making good money, and I'm starting to see why they say "I'm lovin' it" might be the most powerful phrase in the universe. So yeah, that's my story. I know it sounds crazy, and maybe I am crazy, but I swear every word is true. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift at a McDonald's, well, just be prepared for anything. And whatever you do, don't forget the rules. Around midnight, things were pretty dead as usual. I was wiping down the counters while my coworker Gary manned the drive-thru. We were chatting about nothing in particular when his cell phone rang. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I glanced over, I saw Gary's face go pale. His hands started shaking as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, Gary looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Blair," he said, his voice trembling, I have to go. My parents were in a car accident. My mom's in critical condition." My heart sank. Gary and I weren't super close, but I knew how much his family meant to him. "Oh my God, Gary, I'm so sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. Go be with your family. I've got things covered here." Gary hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to leave you alone." "Don't worry about me," I insisted. "Your family needs you. I can handle closing up." He nodded gratefully, hastily gathering his things. As he headed for the door, he tossed me the keys. "Thanks, Blair. I owe you one." And with that, he was gone. I stood there for a moment, the restaurant suddenly feeling much emptier and quieter than before. A knot formed in my stomach as I realized I was now completely alone for the next 5 hours until the morning crew arrived. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. It was just another night shift, right? For the next hour or so, I kept myself busy with cleaning and prep work. The soft hum of the fryers and the occasional car passing by outside were the only sounds. I found myself jumping at small noises, the ice machine dropping a load of cubes, a rat scurrying in the walls. My nerves were on edge after Gary's shocking news. Around 1:30 a.m., I was in the back office counting the day's cash when I heard the distinct chime of the front door opening. My pulse quickened. We were supposed to be drive-through only after midnight. I must have forgotten to lock the lobby doors when Gary left. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sorry, we're closed inside. You'll need to go through the drive-through." No response. Cautiously, I made my way to the front counter. The lobby was empty, the door firmly shut and locked. A chill ran down my spine. I could have sworn I heard it open. Telling myself I was just jumpy from being alone, I went back to the office to finish the cash count. As I was locking up the safe, the kitchen lights suddenly flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. My heart leapt into my throat. "Shit," I muttered, fumbling for my phone flashlight. Must be a blown fuse. I made my way carefully to the breaker box, my light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Just as I reached for the panel, I heard a loud bang from the dining room, like someone had slammed their fist on a table. I froze, blood turning to ice in my veins. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. With trembling hands, I flipped the breakers back on. Light flooded the restaurant once more. I did a thorough check of every nook and cranny, the bathrooms, the play place, behind the counters. Nothing. Not a soul in sight. By now I was seriously freaked out. I considered calling the cops, but what would I tell them? That I heard a noise? That the lights went out? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I called my manager, Luke. "Blair, what's going on?" "It's 2 a.m, he grumbled, half asleep. "I'm sorry to wake you," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "But something weird is happening here. Gary had to leave because of a family emergency, and now I'm hearing strange noises, and the power went out briefly." Luke sighed. "Blair, calm down. I'm sure it's nothing. You're just spooked from being there alone. Everything's fine. But, look, if you're really that scared, you can close up early. But I need you to at least stay until 3, okay? That's when we officially stop drive-through service." I wanted to protest, to beg him to send someone else to finish the shift. But I knew he was right. I was probably overreacting. "Okay," I said reluctantly. "I'll stay until 3. "Good. Try to relax, all right? I'll see you tomorrow." As soon as I hung up, I regretted agreeing to stay. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to get out of there. But I had a job to do, and I didn't want to let Luke down. The next hour dragged by agonizingly slowly. I kept myself busy, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. Anything to distract myself from the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. At 2:55 a.m., I breathed a sigh of relief. Almost done. I started shutting down the kitchen equipment, looking forward to getting the hell out of there. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the play place. My blood ran cold. We didn't have any animatronics or sound systems that could make a noise like that. Against my better judgment, I crept towards the play place entrance. The growl came again, louder this time. It sounded almost hungry. With shaking hands, I pushed open the door. The colorful tubes and slides loomed before me, casting strange shadows in the dim light. I shone my phone flashlight around, its beam barely penetrating the maze of plastic. "Hello?" I called out weakly. "Is someone there?" A flash of movement caught my eye near the ball pit. I swung my light towards it, heart pounding in my chest. For a split second, I saw something. A dark shape, hunched and inhuman, with glowing yellow eyes. It let out a bone-chilling shriek before disappearing into the tangle of tubes. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, bolting out of the play place and through the kitchen. I didn't even bother clocking out or grabbing my things. I just wanted out. As I burst through the back door into the cool night air, I heard that terrible shriek again, closer this time. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. Just as I got the door open, I made the mistake of looking back. There it was, crouched in the doorway. In the light from the parking lot, I could see it clearly now. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Hairless, pale skin stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Its limbs were too long, joints bent at unnatural angles. But its face, God, its face. A mouthful of needle-sharp teeth stretched in a grotesque grin, yellow eyes gleaming with malice. I dove into my car, slamming the door and peeling out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature bound after me with inhuman speed, but I didn't slow down until I was miles away. I called Luke as soon as I got home, babbling hysterically about what I'd seen. He thought I was playing some kind of sick joke at first, but must have heard the genuine terror in my voice. He said he'd check it out himself. The next day, Luke called me. He'd gone to the restaurant at dawn and found nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of any creature, no damage, nothing. Even the security cameras showed nothing unusual, just me running out like I'd seen a ghost. I quit that day. I know what I saw, what I heard. That thing was real, and it was in that McDonald's. Maybe it's still there, lurking in the play place, waiting for its next victim. I don't know if it was after me specifically or if I just happened to be there when it showed up. All I know is I'm never setting foot in that place again, and neither should you. Started off pretty quiet, just the usual trickle of late-night customers grabbing burgers after the bars closed. Around 2 a.m., this massive guy waddled in. I mean, he was easily 400 pounds, if not more. His shirt was barely containing his bulging gut and was stained with what looked like old food grease. As he approached the counter, I could smell him from 6 feet away, a nauseating mix of body odor and stale French fries. He wheezed as he spoke, ordering enough food for a family of 5. "I'll take 3 Big Macs, 2 large fries, a 20-piece nugget, and a Diet Coke," he rasped. I tried not to visibly react as I punched in his order. While I was assembling his massive order, I could feel his beady eyes boring into me. It made my skin crawl. When I handed over the bags of food, his sweaty hands brushed against mine, and I had to suppress a shudder. He plopped down at a table near the counter and started shoveling food into his mouth at an alarming rate. Watching him eat was like witnessing a car wreck, horrifying, but I couldn't look away. Grease and sauce dripped down his multiple chins as he crammed handfuls of fries into his gaping maw. I tried to busy myself with cleaning and restocking, but I kept glancing over at this human garbage disposal in morbid fascination. In less than 10 minutes, he had demolished the mountain of food. I figured he'd waddle out soon, and I could forget this disturbing encounter. But then he heaved himself up and lumbered back to the counter. My stomach dropped as he fixed me with his beady-eyed stare again. "There weren't enough pickles on my Big Macs," he growled. "I want new ones." I blinked in disbelief. "I'm sorry, sir, but you already ate all the food. I can't give you new burgers now." His face contorted in rage, jowls quivering. "Are you calling me a liar?" he bellowed. "I know what I ordered and there weren't enough pickles. Now make me new ones before I come back there and make them myself." My heart was racing. I'd dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this guy was seriously unhinged. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, "Sir, I apologize, but I can't give you free food. If you'd like to purchase new burgers, I'd be happy to make them for you." That's when he lost it completely. With surprising speed for someone his size, he launched himself partway over the counter, meaty hands grasping for me. I stumbled backwards, narrowly avoiding his grasp. "You skinny little bitch," he roared. "I'll teach you to disrespect a paying customer." Panic overtook me, and I bolted for the back office, slamming and locking the door behind me. I could hear him pounding on the door, the whole frame shaking with each blow. "Open this door!" he screamed. "I'm not done with you yet." I cowered in the corner, fumbling for my phone with trembling hands, but before I could dial 911, I heard another voice. Dave, the shift manager who'd been in the back doing inventory. "What the hell is going on out here?" Dave demanded. The pounding on the door stopped. I heard muffled voices, Dave's tone stern but even. Then silence. After a few moments, there was a gentle knock. "Blair, it's Dave. You can come out now. He's gone." I cautiously opened the door, still shaking. Dave explained that he'd threatened to call the guy's mother, which apparently was enough to make him leave. I was bewildered. This enormous, terrifying man was scared of his mom. "That's Stan," Dave sighed. "He comes in a couple times a week, always causes problems. His poor mother is at her wit's end with him. Threatening to call her is the only thing that works." I nodded numbly, still trying to process what had just happened. Dave told me to take a break and collect myself. As I sat in the break room sipping water, I couldn't shake the image of Stan's rage-filled face from my mind. Those wild eyes, flecks of spit flying from his mouth as he lunged at me. It was burned into my memory. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but I remained on edge. Every time the door chimed, I tensed up, half expecting to see Stan's hulking form again. When 6 a.m. finally rolled around, I bolted out of there as fast as I could. On the drive home, my mind kept replaying the encounter. How could someone become so unhinged over pickles? The sheer menace radiating off of Stan was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just his size. There was something fundamentally wrong with him, a darkness behind those beady eyes. I seriously considered quitting after that night. The thought of potentially facing Stan again filled me with dread. But I needed the job, and Dave assured me they'd ban Stan if he ever tried something like that again. Still, for weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about enormous hands reaching for me over the counter. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, phantom sense of body odor and stale fries lingering in my nostrils. It's been months now, and I haven't seen Stan since that night. But I know he's still out there somewhere, terrorizing other fast food workers over trivial complaints. Sometimes when I'm working the late shift and it gets quiet, I find myself glancing nervously at the door, half expecting to see his massive frame filling the doorway. I've dealt with plenty of difficult customers in this job, but none have rattled me like Stan did. There was a primal, animalistic rage to him that went beyond normal human behavior. In those moments when he was trying to grab me, I truly feared for my life. I still work at McDonald's, but I'm a lot more wary now, especially on night shifts. You never know when someone like Stan might come lumbering through those doors. ready to explode over something as insignificant as pickles. That night opened my eyes to how quickly a mundane situation can turn dangerous. Whenever I see morbidly obese customers now, I can't help but tense up a bit, wondering if they might be another Stan. I know it's not fair to judge all overweight people that way, but the trauma of that encounter left its mark on me. I'm sharing this story as a warning to other fast food workers, especially those working late nights. Always trust your instincts if a customer gives you bad vibes, and familiarize yourself with all the possible escape routes and safe spaces in your restaurant. You never know when you might need them. Sometimes I wonder what became of Stan. Is he still out there, terrorizing other McDonald's locations? Did his mother finally put her foot down? Or did his lifestyle finally catch up with him? Part of me hopes I never find out. I'm content to leave Stan as a nightmarish memory, a cautionary tale about the monsters that can lurk in the most mundane places. So if you're working the late shift and you see an enormous man waddle through the door reeking of sweat and fryer grease, do yourself a favor. Make sure there are extra pickles on those burgers. You never know when you might encounter your own Stan. It was a typical Thursday night, or rather Friday morning, around 1:30 a.m. I was working the graveyard shift at the McDonald's on the outskirts of town, the one right off the highway exit. The night had been slow, just a few drunk college kids stumbling in for late-night munchies. I was looking forward to closing up in about an hour and heading home to crash. That's when he pulled up to the drive-through speaker, this middle-aged guy in a beat-up pickup truck. I could tell right away he was wasted. His speech was slurred, and he kept giggling to himself as he tried to place his order. "Hey there," he drawled. "Can I get one of them fish sandwiches? You know, the square ones?" I sighed internally. We hadn't served filet-o-fish that late in years. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have fish sandwiches available right now. Can I interest you in something else?" He made an exaggerated, disappointed sound. "Oh, man, that sucks. All right, just give me a Big Mac then, I guess." I rang up his order and told him to pull around to the window. As he idled there waiting for his food, I could hear him humming tunelessly to himself and tapping on his steering wheel. When I opened the window to hand him his bag, the smell of booze wafted in. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused as he fumbled for his wallet. That's when things started to get weird. He squinted past me into the restaurant and his brow furrowed. "Hey," he said, "what's a little kid doing in there this late?" I froze. There were no other customers inside. I was the only one working that night. I'm sorry, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no one else here." He shook his head emphatically. "Nah, I can see him plain as day. Little boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Blue t-shirt. He's just standing there staring at us." A chill ran down my spine. I remembered the weird rules they'd gone over in my training. Stuff about never acknowledging certain things we might see during late shifts. At the time, I thought it was just some stupid company policy or hazing ritual for new employees. But now, I forced a smile. "Sir, I can assure you there's no one else in the restaurant. Here's your food. Have a good night and please drive safely." He looked confused but took the bag. As he started to pull away, I heard him mutter, "Could have sworn I saw a kid in there." I quickly shut the window, my heart pounding. I told myself he was just drunk and seeing things. But when I turned around, my blood ran cold. There, standing in the middle of the empty dining room, was a small boy in a blue t-shirt. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were fixed on me with an unblinking stare. I let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of trays. The boy didn't react at all to the noise. He just kept staring, completely motionless. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, he'd be gone. But he was still there. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real. I was alone in here. I knew I was. The doors were locked. There was no way a child could have gotten in without me noticing. I remembered more of those strange rules from my training. Don't acknowledge anything unusual you might see. Don't speak to anyone who shouldn't be there. Just keep working like normal no matter what. With shaking hands, I turned back to the drive-through window and tried to focus on cleaning. Maybe if I just ignored it, it would go away. But I could feel those eyes boring into my back. After a few minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to look. I turned around slowly, dreading what I might see. The boy was gone. The dining room was empty again. I let out a shuddering breath, feeling lightheaded with relief. It must have been my imagination, I told myself. I was tired. It was late. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something on the floor where the boy had been standing. I walked over cautiously to get a closer look. It was a small puddle of water, and next to it was a set of small, wet footprints leading toward the play area. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial my phone. I called my manager, babbling about what I'd seen and begging her to come relieve me early. She sounded concerned and said she'd be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I paced nervously behind the counter, jumping at every little sound. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. When my manager finally arrived, I practically ran out the door. I sped home, checking my rearview mirror constantly. For days afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little boy's unblinking stare. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to go back there, especially not for the night shift. My manager seemed understanding, like she'd heard similar stories before. It's been over a week now, and I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes at night, I think I hear the faint sound of wet footsteps in my hallway. But when I look, there's never anyone there. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But I'll never forget those eyes, or the terror I felt in that moment. I used to scoff at ghost stories. Now I'm not so sure. All I know is that I'm never working another late-night fast food shift as long as I live. It was a slow Tuesday, just after 1 a.m. I was wiping down tables, trying to stay awake, when I heard the bell chime as the door opened. I looked up, expecting to see some bleary-eyed truckers, or maybe some college kids looking for late-night pancakes. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the doorway, stood an elderly woman dressed entirely in black. She wore a long, flowing dress that seemed to move on its own, even though there was no breeze. But what really caught my attention was the shawl draped over her head and shoulders. It was pitch black, like it was absorbing all the light around it. I froze, rag still in hand, as she slowly turned to face me. Her movements were unnaturally smooth, almost like she was gliding rather than walking. And then I saw her eyes. God, those eyes. They were wrong, slitted, like a snake's, with an eerie yellow glow that seemed to pierce right through me. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I couldn't move. It was like her gaze had paralyzed me on the spot. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweating, but I was rooted to the floor. The woman, if you could call her that, started moving towards me. Her footsteps made no sound on the linoleum floor. As she got closer, I noticed something else that sent chills down my spine. Despite the overhead lights, she cast no shadow. It was as if she wasn't fully there, like some kind of ghostly projection. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A hallucination from too many late nights? But deep down, I knew this was real. Too real. As she approached, I caught a whiff of something old. Not just elderly person old, but ancient, like dust and decay and forgotten things. It made my stomach churn. She stopped about 5 feet away from me, those reptilian eyes boring into mine. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes, anything to break that terrifying gaze, but I couldn't. I was trapped, a deer in the headlights of something far beyond my understanding. And then, something even stranger happened. A voice in the back of my head, one I'd never heard before, whispered urgently, Ask her where Tony is." I had no idea who or what Tony was, but in that moment, it felt like the most important question in the world, like my life depended on it. With every ounce of willpower I possessed, I forced my trembling lips to move. Where?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where is Tony?" The effect was instantaneous. The woman's eyes widened, showing even more of that sickly yellow. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Fear? Surprise? But before I could process it, she vanished. Not ran away, not ducked behind a booth. Vanished. One moment she was there, boring holes into my soul with those inhuman eyes, and the next, nothing. Like she'd never been there at all. I stood there shaking for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Slowly, feeling started to return to my limbs. I looked around frantically, half expecting her to reappear, but the restaurant was empty, just me and the harsh fluorescent lights. I ran to the door, locking it with trembling hands. Then I checked every booth, every corner, even the bathrooms and kitchen. Nothing. No sign that anyone had been there at all. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of paranoia and confusion. I jumped at every sound, convinced she was going to reappear at any moment. But nothing happened. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I practically ran out of there. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was some kind of waking dream or a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. That woman, or whatever she was, existed, and somehow asking about Tony made her disappear. I've researched everything I can about supernatural encounters, local legends, anything that might explain what happened. But I've found nothing. No reports of similar incidents, no folklore about snake-eyed women in black shawls. The thing that really gets me, though, is the question. Where did that voice in my head come from? How did it know to ask about Tony? And why did that question have such an effect on her? I still work at Denny's, but I switched to day shifts. I can't bring myself to work nights anymore. Every time the door opens, I tense up, half expecting to see that black shawl and those yellow eyes. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I swear I can smell that ancient, dusty scent. I don't know what I experienced that night. I don't know if I'll ever understand it. But I do know one thing. There are things in this world that we can't explain, forces beyond our comprehension. And sometimes they walk into small-town diners at 1:10 a.m., wearing black shawls and looking for someone named Tony. If you ever find yourself working a late-night shift and see an old woman in black, with eyes that don't look quite human, don't freeze up like I did. Ask her where Tony is and pray that she disappears. Day started like any other, the usual morning rush, followed by the quiet lull before the lunch crowd. I was wiping down tables when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I looked up, expecting to see one of our regulars, but instead there was this little boy standing there all alone. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. The first thing I noticed was how dirty he looked, like he'd been playing in mud or something. His clothes were all grimy, and his face was smudged. He had on this faded Pac-Man t-shirt that looked ancient, like something from the 80s. At first I didn't think much of it. Kids wander in sometimes if their parents are parking the car or whatever. But after a few moments, I realized no one was coming in after him. He was just standing there by himself, looking lost and scared. I started to walk over to him, figuring I should check if he was okay. But before I could reach him, he spotted me and came running over. "Please, I can't find my mommy," he cried, grabbing onto my apron. "Can you help me?" My heart broke for the poor kid. I knelt down to his level and tried to comfort him. "It's okay, sweetie. We'll find your mom. Can you tell me where you last saw her?" But he just kept crying and clinging to me. I don't know. Please help me." He was getting more and more worked up. I tried to stay calm and reassuring. "Okay, it's all right. Let's go sit down and we can call the police to help find her, okay?" I started to lead him towards a booth. That's when things got weird. As soon as I mentioned calling the police, the boy's demeanor changed completely. He stopped crying and gave me this look that made my blood run cold. His eyes, I swear they flashed red for a second. "You made the right choice," he said in a voice that sounded way too deep and adult-like for a child. Then he yanked his hand away from mine and bolted for the door. I stood there in shock for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. By the time I ran to the door to look outside, the boy was nowhere in sight. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Shaken, I went to tell my manager what happened. But before I could say anything, he pulled me aside with a grim look on his face. "Did you interact with a child who came in alone?" he asked in a low voice. I nodded, still confused and rattled. "Yeah, this little boy. He was crying about his mom and—" My manager cut me off. "You need to forget about it. Don't mention it to anyone else. It's one of the rules. We don't acknowledge or help lone children who come in here." "What? What are you talking about? What rules?" I was completely baffled. He sighed heavily. "Look, there are certain things about this place that we don't discuss. Strange things happen sometimes. The best thing to do is ignore it and move on. Trust me on this." I wanted to argue, to demand answers about what the hell was going on, but something in his tone and the look in his eyes made me hold my tongue. I just nodded and went back to work, trying to shake off the lingering dread I felt. But I couldn't stop thinking about that boy and his unsettling transformation. Throughout the rest of my shift, I kept seeing flashes of red eyes out of the corner of my vision. Every time I'd whip my head around to look, there'd be nothing there. I started noticing other weird things too. Chairs moving on their own when no one was near them. Whispers that seemed to come from empty booths. At one point, I could have sworn I saw that same Pac-Man shirt reflected in a mirror, but when I turned around, the diner was empty. By the end of my shift, I was a nervous wreck. I practically ran to my car, looking over my shoulder the whole way. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard a child's laughter echoing across the parking lot. I jumped in my car and peeled out of there as fast as I could. For weeks after that, I was on edge constantly. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of glowing red eyes. I kept seeing that boy everywhere, in crowds, on TV, even in my own mirror sometimes. But it was always just for a split second before he'd vanish. I seriously considered quitting my job, but something made me stay. A morbid curiosity about what other rules might exist, what other strange things might happen. Plus, if I'm being honest, I was afraid of what might happen if I tried to leave. It's been 3 months now, and things have mostly gone back to normal. But sometimes I still catch glimpses of that boy out of the corner of my eye. And every time a child comes into the diner alone, my heart races as I remember the manager's warning. I don't know what to make of what happened that day. Was it all in my head, some kind of shared hallucination, or is there really something supernatural going on at that diner? I may never know for sure, but one thing's certain, I'll never look at lone children the same way again, and I'll always wonder what other chilling secrets that old diner might be hiding. Worked there for 2 years, but something felt off that night. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. I kept glancing at the clock, willing it to move faster so I could get out of there. As I was wiping down the last table, I heard a weird scratching sound coming from the back. Probably just a rat or something, I told myself. But then I heard it again, louder this time. My heart started racing. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I reluctantly went to check it out, wielding my mop like a weapon. The storage room door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. Nothing, just boxes and supplies like normal. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling silly for getting so worked up. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. A dark shape darted past the doorway. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "We're closed." Silence. Then footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the hall towards me. I backed away, gripping the mop so tight my knuckles turned white. A figure emerged from the shadows. My blood ran cold. It was dressed in a grimy black and white striped uniform, like some twisted version of our work clothes. But that wasn't the worst part. Its face, oh God, its face. It wore a cracked plastic mask, frozen in a horrific grin. Rotten yellow teeth poked out from behind it, and its eyes, pitch-black voids that seemed to stare right through me. I was paralyzed with fear as it lumbered towards me. The stench of decay filled my nostrils. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped in a gravelly whisper. "It's past closing time." I finally found my voice. Who are you? What do you want?" It cocked its head, regarding me with those soulless eyes. "They call me the Burger," it said. "I protect this place after hours, make sure no one lingers too long." My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. I'm sorry. I was just finishing up. I'm leaving now." The Burger took another step closer. I could see maggots crawling in the folds of its rotting flesh. "Better hurry," it growled. "Bad things happen to those who overstay their welcome." With a choked sob, I bolted for the door. I heard its heavy footsteps behind me as I ran. Just as I reached for the handle, a gnarled hand grabbed my shoulder. "Remember," it hissed in my ear, "never stay past midnight." I yanked free and burst out of the restaurant, not stopping until I reached my car. Hands shaking, I fumbled with my keys and peeled out of the parking lot. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The Burger stood in the doorway, watching me go. Then it slowly raised one decaying hand and waved. I didn't sleep for days after that. I kept reliving those terrifying moments, seeing those black eyes whenever I closed my own. I never went back to Burger Barn, and I warned all my co-workers about working late. To this day, I can't drive past that place without breaking into a cold sweat. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I know the truth. The burger is real, and it's still out there, guarding that restaurant when the sun goes down. I don't know why it let me go that night. Maybe it was giving me a warning, a chance to spread the word, or maybe it just wasn't quite midnight yet. Either way, I count myself lucky to have escaped. But I often think about what would have happened if I'd stayed just a few minutes longer. What exactly does the burger do to those unfortunate souls who linger past closing time? I shudder to imagine. All I know is I'll never work another late-night fast food shift as long as I live, and if you're smart, you won't either, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the clock to strike 12. The memory of that night still haunts me. The putrid smell of decay, the sound of heavy footsteps, those horrible black eyes. I can recall it all with vivid clarity. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that raspy voice whispering, "Remember, never stay past midnight." I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination or some sick prank. But deep down, I know the truth. The burger was real as anything I've ever encountered. For weeks after, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. My parents were worried sick, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what happened. They'd never believe me anyway. I did some research, trying to find any similar stories or urban legends, but I came up empty. Whatever the burger was, it seemed to be unique to that particular burger barn. Part of me wanted to go back, to prove to myself that it wasn't real, but I could never work up the courage. Just driving past that place filled me with dread. I wonder sometimes about my old co-workers, if any of them ever encountered the burger. Did they heed my warnings about closing alone? Or did some poor soul end up staying too late one night? I shudder to think what might have happened to them. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more cautious now, especially at night. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, always on edge, and I have a deep-seated fear of masks that I just can't shake. But most of all, I'm acutely aware of how thin the veil is between our world and whatever lies beyond. There are things out there that defy explanation, entities that exist in the shadows. The burger opened my eyes to a reality I can never unsee. I still have so many unanswered questions. What exactly was the burger? Why was it guarding that specific restaurant? And what would have happened if I'd stayed past midnight? Part of me wants answers, but a bigger part is terrified of finding out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. All I know for certain is that I'll never forget that night. The terror, the confusion, the sheer wrongness of it all. It's seared into my memory forever. So if you're ever working a late shift, especially at a fast food joint, be careful. Keep an eye on the clock, and whatever you do, don't stay past closing time, because you never know what might be waiting in the darkness, ready to remind you that you don't belong. The burger taught me that lesson. I just hope others can learn from my experience without having to face that horror themselves. Because trust me, once you've looked into those soulless black eyes, you're never quite the same again. I still catch myself glancing over my shoulder sometimes, half expecting to see that grotesque masked face leering at me. The trauma of that night lingers, a constant reminder of how quickly normalcy can shatter. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying every detail in my mind. The creak of the storage room door, the heavy footsteps, that rasping voice that seemed to come from the grave itself. I've tried to move on, to put it behind me, but how do you just forget something like that? It's like trying to forget how to breathe. The memory is a part of me now, for better or worse. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more. Should I have tried to investigate further, warned more people? Or was I right to just run and never look back? The guilt eats at me sometimes. What if someone else encountered the burger and wasn't as lucky as I was? Could I have prevented it somehow? But then I remember those black eyes, that rotting flesh, and I know there was nothing more I could have done. Some things are beyond our power to change or understand. I've never told anyone the full story before now. How could I? Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. Sometimes I almost wish that were the case. At least then I'd have an explanation. But I know what I saw. What I experienced was real as the keyboard I'm typing on right now. The burger exists, and it's out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows of that cursed restaurant. I don't know if sharing this will help anyone. Maybe it's just a way for me to finally process what happened. But if even one person reads this and thinks twice about working late, then I guess it's worth it. Because trust me, you don't want to meet the burger. You don't want to smell that stench of decay or hear that bone-chilling rasp. You don't want to look into those empty black eyes and see the void staring back. So please, take my advice. When it's time to close up shop, don't linger. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Just lock the door and leave. Because you never know what might be waiting in the darkness. And some things once seen can never be unseen. The burger taught me that lesson. I just hope others can learn from my experience without having to face that nightmare themselves. Because in this world, there are far worse things than going home early. And sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. I've been noticing weird things during my shifts. Strange noises, items moving on their own, just a general creepy vibe. But I tried to brush it off as sleep deprivation or an overactive imagination. Until last night, when I saw something that I can't explain away. It was around 3 a.m. and I was restocking the condiments near the drive-through window. Suddenly, I heard a child's laughter coming from the play area. My blood ran cold. We'd been closed for hours, and I knew I was the only one in the building. I slowly turned around and saw a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing by the slide. She was pale as a ghost, wearing an old-fashioned dress. When our eyes met, she smiled at me and then literally vanished into thin air. I nearly pissed myself. I ran to the break room and locked myself in there until my shift ended at 6 a.m. As soon as my manager arrived to open, I told him I quit and got the hell out of there. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Was I going crazy, or was that place actually haunted? I tossed and turned all day, unable to sleep. By that afternoon, I'd worked up the courage to confront my boss, Dave, and demand some answers. I stormed into his office without knocking. He looked up from his computer, startled. "Blair, what are you doing here? Your shift doesn't start for hours." "I'm not here to work, Dave. I'm here for answers. What the hell is going on in this place at night?" His face darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about. If you have a complaint, you can fill out the proper forms." "Cut the crap!" I slammed my hands on his desk. "I saw a ghost last night, a little girl in the play area. She disappeared right in front of me, so don't tell me nothing's going on." Dave sighed and leaned back in his chair. He suddenly looked very tired. "Sit down, Blair." I hesitated, then took a seat across from him. My heart was pounding. "How much did you see exactly?" he asked. I told him about the girl and all the other weird things I'd noticed over the past few weeks. As I spoke, Dave's expression grew more and more grim. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I was hoping we could keep this contained. The night crew has always been good about keeping their mouths shut, but I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone like you came along. What do you mean, someone like me? Someone who can see them, the spirits. Most people can't, you know, even at night when the veil is thinner. I felt a chill run down my spine. So it's true then? This place is haunted? Dave nodded. Has been for decades, long before it was a McDonald's. There used to be an orphanage on this land back in the 1920s. Terrible things happened there. The children. He trailed off, shaking his head. Let's just say a lot of young souls never found peace. They linger here still. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Part of me wanted to think Dave was messing with me, but deep down I knew he was telling the truth. It explained everything I'd experienced. So what now? I asked. I can't keep working here knowing all this. Actually, Dave said, leaning forward, I was hoping you would reconsider quitting. I stared at him in disbelief. Are you kidding me? After what I saw? Look, Blair, people with your sensitivity are rare. We need someone like you on the night shift. Someone who can see what's really going on and help keep things under control. Under control? What does that even mean? Dave sighed. The spirits can get restless sometimes, mischievous. We need someone to calm them down, redirect their energy, keep them from causing too much trouble or revealing themselves to the wrong people. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you want me to be some kind of ghost wrangler? At a McDonald's? This is insane. I know it sounds crazy, but think about it. You have a unique gift. You could use it to help these lost souls find peace. And, he added, I'm prepared to make it worth your while financially. I scoffed. No amount of money is worth $27 an hour. I froze. That was more than double what I was making now. With that kind of money, I could pay off my student loans in no time, maybe even afford to move out of my parents' place. Dave could see he had my attention. Plus, full benefits, health, dental, 401k, and we'll work around your class schedule, of course. My mind was reeling. This was insane, completely insane. And yet, what exactly would I have to do? I asked cautiously. Dave smiled. Nothing too difficult. Just keep an eye on things, make sure the spirits don't get out of hand. Talk to them if needed, help them feel heard. Log any unusual activity. And of course, maintain absolute discretion. No one outside of management can know about any of this. I took a deep breath. Was I really considering this? It went against everything rational in my brain. And yet, I couldn't deny the allure, both financial and, if I was honest with myself, the intrigue of it all. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Dave nodded. Of course. Take the rest of the week off, paid. Let me know your decision by Monday. I left his office in a daze, my mind swirling. Part of me still couldn't believe this was real. Ghosts? At McDonald's? It sounded like a bad movie plot. But I knew what I'd seen. And now that Dave had confirmed it, so many little things from my shifts suddenly made sense. The odd noises, the feeling of being watched, items moving on their own. As I drove home, I found myself actually considering his offer. The money was incredible, especially for a college student. And there was a part of me that was undeniably curious about exploring this supernatural world further. But could I handle it? The fear, the strangeness of it all? What if things escalated beyond mischievous child spirits? I tossed and turned all night, weighing the pros and cons. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I texted Dave, I'm in, but I want $30 an hour and a guarantee that I can quit at any time if things get too intense. His reply came quickly. Deal. See you Monday night, And Blair, welcome to the real night shift. As I set my phone down, a mix of excitement and dread settled in my stomach. What had I just gotten myself into? I guess I'll find out soon enough. All I know is my nights at McDonald's will never be the same again. It all started on a Friday evening. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted from a long week of coding at my tech startup. As I walked through the door, Vanessa rushed over to greet me with a tight hug and a kiss. God, I love that woman. She always knows how to make me feel better after a rough day. Hey, babe, how was work? She asked, her eyes searching mine with concern. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Same old, same old. Bugs to fix, deadlines to meet. Nothing I can't handle, though. Vanessa gave me a small smile, but I could see the worry lines forming between her brows. She knew what was coming next. Derek, you're not going out tonight, are you? She asked hesitantly. I averted my gaze, feeling a pang of guilt. Vanessa hated my late-night motorcycle rides. She always worried I'd get hurt, but it was the only thing that helped clear my head after a stressful week. I won't be long, I promise. Just a quick ride to decompress, I said, trying to reassure her. Vanessa's face fell, but she nodded in resignation. Okay, just please be careful. You know I worry about you out there on that bike. I pulled her close, breathing in the comforting scent of her shampoo. I know, babe. I'll be extra careful, just for you. I love you. I love you too, she murmured against my chest. After a quick shower and change of clothes, I kissed Vanessa goodbye and headed out to the garage. My sleek black motorcycle sat there waiting for me, practically begging to hit the open road. I swung my leg over the seat, revved the engine, and took off into the night. The cool air whipped against my face as I sped down the empty streets. This was exactly what I needed, the freedom of the road, nothing but me and my bike. I let my mind wander, all the stress of the work week melting away. I'm not sure how long I'd been riding when I noticed the fog starting to roll in. At first it was just wisps here and there, but soon it became a thick blanket obscuring the road ahead. I slowed down, squinting to see through the murky haze. That's when things started to get weird. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement in the fog. I turned my head, but whatever it was had vanished. Probably just my imagination, I told myself. But then I saw it again, a dark shape darting through the mist. My heart started to race. What the hell was going on? I gripped the handlebars tighter, trying to focus on the road, but the shapes kept appearing and disappearing, always just out of clear sight. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the fog right in front of me. I swerved hard to avoid hitting it, nearly losing control of the bike. As I righted myself, I caught a glimpse of something. It wasn't human, that's for sure. Tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, and its face. God, its face. Just thinking about it now makes me want to throw up. I gunned the engine, desperate to get away from whatever the hell that thing was. But no matter how fast I went, I kept seeing more of them in the fog. Their twisted forms would appear for just a split second before vanishing again. I was in full-on panic mode now. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely control the bike. I had no idea where I was or which direction I was even going anymore. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched keening sound that seemed to come from all around me. It started low, but quickly grew in volume until it was so loud I thought my eardrums would burst. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't let go of the handlebars. In my terror and confusion, I didn't see the curve in the road until it was too late. I tried to brake and turn, but the bike went into a skid. The last thing I remember is flying through the air as my bike went down. I woke up in the hospital with Vanessa by my side, holding my hand. She had tears in her eyes as she told me how worried she'd been when I didn't come home. Apparently, some early morning joggers had found me unconscious on the side of the road and called an ambulance. The doctors said I was lucky, just a mild concussion and some scrapes and bruises. But they couldn't explain the strange marks they found on my arms and legs. Long, thin scratches that looked almost like claw marks. I tried to tell Vanessa and the doctors what had happened, about the fog and the creatures I'd seen, but they all just exchanged worried glances and told me it must have been hallucinations from the concussion. But I know what I saw out there. Those things were real, I'm sure of it. And the truly terrifying part? I can still hear that keening sound sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. It's faint, but unmistakable. I haven't been on my bike since that night. Vanessa is relieved, thinking I've finally given up my dangerous hobby. But the truth is, I'm too scared to go out after dark anymore. I keep replaying that night over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Was it all just in my imagination, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion? Or did I stumble into something that night, something not of this world? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never forget what I experienced out there in the fog, and a part of me is terrified that one day those things might find me again. For now, I'm trying to move on with my life. I'm throwing myself into work, spending more time with Vanessa. But I can't shake the feeling that something fundamental has changed, like a veil has been lifted, showing me a glimpse of a darker, more sinister reality lurking just beneath the surface of our world. I'm not sure why I'm sharing all this. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has experienced something similar, that I'm not alone in this. Or maybe I just needed to get it off my chest to try and process what happened. All I know is that I'll never look at a foggy night the same way again. And if you're out there reading this, take my advice. Stick to the well-lit roads, and if you see fog rolling in, turn back. You never know what might be hiding in the mist. The motel itself was creepy from the start, all peeling paint and flickering lights, but I figured it was just old, nothing sinister. That first night, I settled in behind the front desk around 10 p.m., ready for a boring shift of watching TV and maybe checking in the occasional trucker. Around midnight, this weird guy showed up. He was wearing an old-fashioned suit and hat like something out of the 1940s. His face was gaunt and pale in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in years. "I'd like a room for the night," he said, not quite making eye contact. I started the usual check-in process, but he cut me off. "Before we proceed, there are some rules you must follow tonight. Your life may depend on it." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke, but his expression remained deadly serious as he handed me a folded piece of paper. "Read these carefully," he said. "Do not deviate from them under any circumstances." My hands were shaking as I unfolded the paper. The list was handwritten in spidery script. 1. Do not leave the front desk between midnight and 6 a.m. 2. If you hear knocking, do not open any doors. 3. Ignore any voices calling your name. 4. Do not look directly at any reflective surfaces. 5. If the lights flicker, close your eyes and count to 10. 6. Do not investigate any strange sounds. 7. If a child approaches you, do not speak to it or acknowledge it in any way. I looked up, ready to tell this guy he was crazy, but he had vanished. I hadn't even heard the door. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was just some weirdo playing a prank. But as the night wore on, a feeling of dread settled over me. The silence in the motel lobby seemed to press in on all sides. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a soft knocking sound coming from down the hallway. My heart started racing. It was probably nothing, right? Just the building settling or the wind. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I gripped the edge of the desk, willing myself to stay put. The rule echoed in my head. Do not open any doors. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, moving from door to door. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, lulling me into a false sense of security before starting up again, even closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a new sound cut through the silence, a child's laughter. It was high and eerie, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. "Hello, mister," a small voice said right in front of me. "Will you play with me?" Every instinct screamed at me to look, to respond, but I remembered the rule about not acknowledging any children. I kept my eyes firmly closed, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "I know you can hear me," the voice said, a hint of menace creeping in. "It's not nice to ignore people." I felt something cold brush against my arm and nearly screamed, but I held firm, not moving a muscle. After what felt like an eternity, I heard small footsteps retreating. When I finally opened my eyes, the lobby was empty. But in the mirror behind the desk, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A small figure with no face, just smooth blank skin where features should be. I quickly averted my eyes, remembering the rule about reflective surfaces. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision. Whispers and screams echoed down empty hallways. The lights flickered constantly, and each time I obediently closed my eyes and counted to 10, dreading what I might see when I opened them. At one point, I clearly heard my mom's voice calling my name. It sounded desperate, pleading. Every fiber of my being wanted to run to her, to help her. But I white-knuckled the desk and stayed put, tears streaming down my face. I've never been so grateful to see the sun rise as I was that morning. As soon as my watch hit 6 a.m., I bolted out the door, not even bothering to wait for the day shift to arrive. I quit that job on the spot and haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear phantom knocks on my bedroom door, and I can never shake the feeling that something is watching me from just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to break the rules again. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't followed those instructions to the letter, and honestly, I never want to find out. All I know is that motel is a place of pure evil, and I thank my lucky stars I made it out alive. The strangest part? When I drove by a few days later to pick up my last paycheck, the motel was boarded up and abandoned. It looked like it had been that way for years, all overgrown with weeds. But I know what I experienced was real. Those hours of terror are seared into my brain forever. I still have nightmares about that faceless child and the sound of knocking getting closer and closer. I don't know if it was ghosts or demons or something even worse. But I do know that evil is real, and sometimes it's hiding in the most ordinary places. So if you're ever driving late at night and come across an old motel in the middle of nowhere, just keep on driving. And if a man in an old-fashioned suit tries to give you a list of rules, run as fast as you can in the other direction. Some nights are better left unsleeping. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me. Was it all some sort of mass hallucination? A vivid nightmare that felt real? Or did I really experience something supernatural? I've tried researching the history of that motel, but I can't find any records of it ever existing. It's like it appeared for one night just to torment me, then vanished without a trace. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch a glimpse of movement in a mirror or hear a child's laughter when I'm home alone, and the terror comes rushing back. Whatever was in that motel, I think a piece of it followed me home. I haven't told many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I needed to get this off my chest, to try to process it somehow. Writing it all out has brought those memories flooding back in vivid detail. My hands are shaking as I type this. If anyone else has experienced anything similar, please let me know. I need to know I'm not crazy, that I'm not alone in this. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, remember, follow the rules, no matter how strange they seem. It might just save your life. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that night, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never work another night shift as long as I live. Some darkness is better left unexplored. The neon sign flickered ominously as I approached. Shear's Nighttime Convenience and Grocery. Open 24/7, the perfect place for a desperate dad to pick up some night shift work. I pushed open the door, hearing the little bell jingle. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the aisles of snacks and household goods. A bored-looking guy was slouched behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He barely glanced up as I approached. "Hi there," I said, trying to sound confident. "I saw the help wanted sign in the window. Are you still hiring for the night shift?" He looked me up and down, his expression unreadable. "Maybe. You ever worked retail before?" I shook my head. "No, but I'm a fast learner. I really need this job. My daughter's sick and I've got medical bills piling up." Something flashed in his eyes at that. "Sick kid, huh? That's rough." He paused, seeming to consider. "All right, I'll grab the manager. Wait here." He disappeared into the back, leaving me alone in the empty store. I bounced nervously on my heels, praying this would work out. A few minutes later, a tall man in a crisp button-down emerged. "So you're looking for work?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Benny, the night manager here." I shook his hand, noting his firm grip. "Yes, sir, I am. I'm willing to work any hours, do whatever needs to be done." Benny nodded slowly. "Night shift can be rough. Not many people cut out for it. But if you're desperate enough..." He trailed off, studying me. "All right, why don't you start tonight? We'll do a trial run, see how you handle it." I couldn't believe my luck. "Really? That would be amazing. Thank you so much." He waved off my gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. Night shift here isn't for the faint of heart, but if you can hack it, the pay is good." As I followed Benny to the back to fill out some paperwork, I had no idea just how prophetic those words would turn out to be. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have run out of that store and never looked back. But desperation makes fools of us all. The first few nights were uneventful enough. Stocking shelves, manning the register for the occasional late-night customer. But there was something off about the place. The way Benny and Molly, the assistant manager, would whisper to each other and abruptly stop when I approached. The weird looks some of the regulars gave me, like they knew something I didn't. It was about a week in when things started to get truly strange. I was restocking the coolers when I heard the bell jingle. A well-dressed older man walked in, looking completely out of place among our usual crowd of night owls and insomniacs. Benny greeted him warmly. "Mr. Jaspin, good to see you. Your usual order is ready in the back." The man, Mr. Jaspin, nodded curtly. "Excellent. I trust everything is fresh?" Of course. only the best for our VIP customers. They disappeared into the stockroom together. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Mr. Jaspin was carrying a large, unmarked box. I couldn't shake the feeling that something very wrong had just happened. As the weeks went on, I noticed more and more unsettling things. Hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked by. Strange noises coming from the basement that I was told never to enter. Customers who came in at odd hours, exchanging meaningful glances with Benny before being ushered into the back. One night, I was mopping the floors when I overheard Benny on the phone. "Yeah, we've got a fresh shipment coming in tomorrow night. Grade A stuff, real top quality. How many units you need?" It didn't sound like he was talking about groceries. My suspicions were confirmed a few nights later. I was restocking shelves when I heard raised voices coming from the stockroom. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer to listen. "I'm telling you, the cops are starting to sniff around," a voice I recognized as Lee, my co-worker, was saying. "We need to be more careful." "Relax," Benny replied. "We've got friends in high places. No one's going to look too closely at a boring convenience store." "But what if—" "I said relax," Benny snapped. "Just focus on processing the new inventory. We've got a big order to fill for Mr. Jaspin tomorrow." My blood ran cold. What the hell kind of inventory were they talking about? I knew I should have quit right then and there. But I needed this job so desperately. Danny's treatments were working, but they were astronomically expensive. I told myself I was imagining things, that it couldn't be as bad as I feared. God, I was so wrong. The night everything fell apart started like any other. I was behind the register, half dozing in the fluorescent glare, when Mr. Jaspin walked in. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "I'm here to inspect some merchandise." I nodded nervously, paging Benny on the intercom. He appeared moments later, greeting Mr. Jaspin warmly. "Right this way, sir. We have some excellent specimens for you to choose from tonight." Specimens? What the hell? They headed for the basement door, the one I'd been told never to open. But something made me follow, keeping to the shadows. The stench hit me as soon as they opened the door, the unmistakable smell of death and decay. I crept down the stairs after them, my heart pounding. What I saw in that basement will haunt me for the rest of my days. Row after row of body bags, neatly stacked on metal shelves. Some were still, but others, oh God, some of them were moving. Mr. Jaspin walked among them, unzipping bags to inspect their contents. Human bodies in various states of decay, some fresh, some not so fresh. "This one looks promising," he said, gesturing to a bag containing what looked like a young woman, still quite lively. "How much?" "For you? A steal at $50,000, Benny replied. I must have made a noise because suddenly they both turned and saw me standing there. The look in Benny's eyes was murderous. Well, looks like we have a little spy," Mr. Jaspin said calmly. "What should we do with him, Benny?" I didn't stick around to hear the answer. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. Out of the store, down the street, not stopping until I reached my apartment and bolted the door behind me. My hands shook as I dialed 911, but I froze with my finger over the call button. What could I even say? Who would believe me? I spent the rest of the night pacing, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I called in sick to work. Benny's voice on the other end was cold. "That's too bad," he said. "We were hoping you'd come in. We need to have a little chat." I hung up without responding. What the hell was I going to do? I couldn't go back there, but I couldn't go to the police either. Who knew how deep this went? How many people were involved? It wasn't until later that day that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was researching the store name, desperate for any information, when I stumbled across a Japanese translation site. Sheer in Japanese means death. Sheer's nighttime convenience and grocery. Death's nighttime convenience and grocery. How could I have been so blind? It's been 2 weeks since that night. I haven't left my apartment, too terrified of what or who might be waiting for me outside. Danny keeps asking when I'm going back to work. I don't know what to tell her. I know they're out there, waiting. I've seen the unmarked van parked across the street, the men in suits watching my building. They know where I live, where Danny goes to school. I don't know what to do. I can't go to the police. For all I know, they're in on it too. I can't run. I have no money, nowhere to go. And Danny needs her treatments. All I know is that I've stumbled into something far bigger and more horrifying than I ever could have imagined. A vast criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight, dealing in human lives like they were just another commodity. And now they know that I know. I'm writing this as a record in case anything happens to me. If you're reading this, please, be careful. The world is full of monsters wearing human faces. Trust no one. And whatever you do, stay far, far away from Sheer's nighttime convenience and grocery. Some bargains come at too high a price. I was just a regular inmate at Springfield Correctional Center, counting down the days until my release. But everything changed the day I was told I was being transferred to some place called North Frost Penitentiary. I had never heard of it before, and neither had any of the other prisoners. The guards wouldn't tell us anything about it either, which only made me more uneasy. The morning of the transfer, they loaded me and another inmate named Timmy onto a prison bus. Our guard was this huge guy named Shay. He must have weighed at least 300 pounds. As we drove away from Springfield, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something about this just felt wrong. We drove for hours through empty countryside. I'm talking miles and miles of nothing but abandoned coal mines and dead trees. The further we went, the more isolated it felt. I kept trying to make conversation with Timmy or Shay, but they both seemed on edge too and didn't say much. Just when I thought we must be getting close to civilization again, Shay turned down this unmarked dirt road that disappeared into thick woods. That's when the panic really started to set in. Where the hell were they taking us? After what felt like an eternity bumping down that road, we finally came to a clearing. And there it was, North Frost Penitentiary. Only this didn't look like any prison I'd ever seen. It was this massive stone fortress, like something out of a horror movie. The walls were at least 50 feet high and lined with razor wire. Watchtowers loomed over us, but I didn't see any guards in them. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed these weird symbols carved into the stone. They looked ancient, almost like runes or something. A chill went down my spine. What kind of prison was this? The gate creaked open and Shay drove us inside. The courtyard was empty. No other vehicles, no prisoners, nothing. Just this eerie silence. Shay parked and ordered us off the bus. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped down. That's when I heard it. This low, guttural growl coming from somewhere inside the prison. Timmy must have heard it too because he suddenly shouted, "What the fuck was that?" Before Shay could answer, the main doors of the prison burst open. What came out? I still have trouble believing what I saw. It looked like a man, but twisted and deformed. Muscles bulging unnaturally, hair sprouting all over its body, razor-sharp claws where its hands should be. Its face was the worst part, elongated into a wolf-like snout filled with gleaming fangs. I was frozen in terror as this thing bounded towards us on all fours. Shay yelled for us to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Just as it was about to reach us, a booming voice echoed across the courtyard. "Heal!" The creature skidded to a stop, cowering. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the doorway, a tall man in an impeccable suit. As he walked towards us, I realized with growing horror that where his face should be was just blank skin. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. "Welcome to North Frost," the faceless man said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm the CEO. You're our newest participants." Shay started sputtering, saying there must be some mistake. This couldn't be the right place. The CEO just laughed, a chilling sound with no visible mouth to produce it. "Oh, there's no mistake," he said. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Now let's get you processed, shall we?" Two more of those wolf creatures appeared, grabbing Timmy and me roughly. I tried to struggle, but their grip was like iron. As they dragged us towards the prison, I looked back and saw Shay arguing with the CEO. The last thing I heard before the heavy doors slammed shut behind us was Shay's scream cut brutally short. Inside was like a nightmare funhouse. The halls twisted at impossible angles. Doors appeared and disappeared at random. And the sounds, God, the sounds. Screams of agony echoed from every direction, punctuated by inhuman howls and the whir of machinery. The creatures shoved us into what looked like a processing room, only instead of normal intake equipment, there were all these medieval-looking torture devices, racks, iron maidens, you name it. And standing there waiting for us was, I guess you'd call him the warden. He was even more terrifying than the CEO, if that's possible. 9 feet tall at least, with leathery red skin and horns curling from his forehead. When he grinned at us, his mouth was full of needle-like teeth. "Fresh meat," he rumbled. "Let's see how long you last." What happened next is still a blur. They stripped us, hosed us down with freezing water, and then started with the intake procedures. I won't go into details, but it involved a lot of those torture devices. I've never felt pain like that before. I thought I was going to die. Just when I didn't think I could take any more, alarms started blaring. The warden cursed and stormed out. The wolf creatures followed, leaving Timmy and me alone. I don't know where I found the strength, but somehow I managed to get free of my restraints. I grabbed Timmy, who was barely conscious, and we stumbled out of the room. The halls were chaos. Prisoners, or what was left of them, running in every direction. Guards trying to maintain order. And in the middle of it all, these small figures darting around. It took me a second to realize they were children, but not normal children. Their skin was gray and rotting, their eyes milky white, and they were wielding scalpels and other surgical tools, slashing at anyone who got close. I half-carried, half-dragged Timmy through the madness, desperately searching for a way out. We turned a corner and there was the CEO, standing calmly amidst the carnage. He turned that blank face towards us, and I swear I could feel him smiling. "Leaving so soon?" he said. "But we're just getting started." He raised his hand, and suddenly Timmy went rigid. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he started convulsing. I tried to hold on to him, but it was like he was being pulled by an invisible force. The CEO just stood there as Timmy was yanked away from me, his body twisting at unnatural angles until I couldn't watch. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Somehow I found my way back to the entrance. The gate was open. I guess in all the chaos someone had triggered it. I sprinted across the courtyard towards the bus. If I could just get to it, maybe I had a chance. I was halfway there when I heard the warden's roar behind me. I risked a glance back and saw him charging after me, moving inhumanly fast for something so huge. I reached the bus, just as he caught up to me. His clawed hand swiped at my back, tearing through my shirt and into my flesh. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline kept me moving. I dove into the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys Shay had left in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the warden reached the door. He grabbed the frame, metal groaning as he started to tear the bus apart. In desperation, I floored it in reverse. The sudden movement caught him off guard and he lost his grip. I spun the wheel hard, the bus fishtailing as I aimed for the gate. In the rearview mirror, I could see the warden and the wolf creatures in pursuit. The CEO stood watching from the steps, that blank face somehow radiating satisfaction. I crashed through the gate at full speed. The bus shuddered, and I thought for sure it would stall, but somehow it kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't look back. I just drove and drove until the sun came up and my fuel gauge was on empty. I abandoned the bus in some little town and wandered the streets in a daze. Eventually, the police picked me up. I tried to tell them what happened, but they just thought I was crazy or on drugs. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe it was all some hallucination. But these scars on my back feel pretty damn real. They sent me to a psychiatric hospital instead of back to prison. I've been here for months now. The doctors keep trying to get me to talk about what happened, but I can't. Every time I think about it, I start shaking uncontrollably. All I can do is sit here, rocking back and forth, and whisper the same words over and over. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't even know who I'm apologizing to anymore. Shay, Timmy, all those other prisoners I left behind? Or maybe I'm apologizing to myself for not being able to save anyone, for barely being able to save myself. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make sense of what happened at North Frost. All I know is that the nightmares never stop. Every night I'm back there, running through those twisted halls, the howls of the damned echoing in my ears. And every night I wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the warden's laughter still ringing in my head. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really escaped at all. Maybe this hospital is just another part of their sick game. Maybe I'll be trapped in this nightmare forever. If anyone out there is reading this, please stay away from North Frost. Don't let them take you there. And if you hear about anyone being transferred there, do whatever you can to stop it. No one deserves what I saw in that place. No one. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It started around 3:30 a.m. I was up late, as usual, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine outside my window. At first, I didn't think much of it. We don't get much traffic here, especially not at that hour, but I figured it was probably just someone passing through. But then I heard it again the next night, and the next, always at exactly 3:33 a.m. It was weird enough that I decided to take a peek out my window to see what was going on. What I saw chilled me to my core. There, idling right in front of my house, was a giant red bus. But this wasn't any ordinary bus. Its paint was a deep, unnatural crimson, the color of fresh blood, and emblazoned on the side in stark white letters were the words, Furno Express. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. We don't even have public transportation in Frost Hollow. Where the hell did this thing come from? As I watched, frozen, the doors of the bus opened with a hiss. And that's when true terror gripped me, because what came out of that bus wasn't human, not even close. They were tall, impossibly thin creatures, dressed in bright orange jumpsuits. But where their faces should have been, there was nothing, just smooth, featureless skin. My brain couldn't even process what I was seeing at first. I counted 5 of them as they filed out of the bus in perfect unison. They stood motionless on my lawn for a moment, then began to move. Not walk exactly, more like they glided across the ground, and they were heading straight for my front door. Panic seized me. I ducked down below the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. What the fuck were those things? What did they want? I heard a faint scratching at my door, like long nails dragging across the wood. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, I summoned the courage to peek out the window again. The creatures were gone. So was the bus. The street was dark and empty, as if nothing had ever happened. I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream or hallucination, but deep down I knew what I had seen was real. The next night, I was ready. I set up my phone to record from the window, determined to get proof of whatever the hell was going on. Sure enough, at 3:33 a.m. on the dot, that blood-red bus rolled up again. This time, I forced myself to keep watching as those faceless things emerged. There was something almost hypnotic about their fluid movements. Before I knew what was happening, I found myself walking to my front door in a daze. It was like my body was on autopilot. Some part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to run and hide. But I couldn't resist the pull. I opened the door. The creatures were there waiting. Up close, they were even more terrifying. I could sense an alien intelligence emanating from them. One reached out a spindly hand and touched my forehead. Everything went black. I came to in a vast, dimly lit space. For a moment I thought I was outside. I could see stars twinkling overhead. But then I realized the sky was actually a domed ceiling, painted to look like a night sky. I was lying on hard-packed dirt. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I made out other shapes around me, people, other humans. "Hey, mister, you okay?" a young voice asked. I turned to see a boy of about 10 or 11 looking at me with concern. I think so," I managed to croak out. "Where are we? What is this place?" The boy, Ian was his name, filled me in on what he knew, which wasn't much. We were in some kind of massive underground complex that the other captives had taken to calling the playpen. No one knew exactly where it was located or how long they'd been there. Time seemed to work differently in this place. As Ian spoke, I took in more of our surroundings. We seemed to be in a kind of desert landscape, but clearly artificial. In the center loomed an immense black monolith, stretching all the way up to the starry ceiling. Just looking at it filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. Over the next few hours, or was it days, I met some of the other prisoners. There was Teddy, a burly, bearded man who had been there the longest from what we could tell, and Jackie, a kindly older woman who did her best to keep everyone's spirits up. They filled me in on the horrors of this place. The faceless creatures in orange, which they called stalkers, would periodically appear to drag people away. No one who was taken ever came back, but the stalkers weren't even the worst of it. Sometimes massive tentacled monstrosities would emerge from hidden tunnels to hunt. The other captives called them star spawn. Just hearing about them made my skin crawl. And then there was the Black God. No one had seen it directly, but sometimes a massive shape could be glimpsed moving across the starry ceiling. Teddy swore it was some kind of gargantuan tentacled horror that slumbered up there, waiting to awaken and devour us all. I tried to hold on to hope, to believe we could find a way out of this nightmare. But as time wore on, I felt myself sinking into despair. This place felt wrong on a fundamental level, like it shouldn't exist in our reality. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the stalkers came again. A group of them glided into our area, heading straight for us. Panic erupted as people tried to flee. In the chaos, I lost track of Ian. I saw Jackie get snatched up by one of the creatures. Her terrified scream cut off abruptly as they dragged her away. Teddy and I managed to slip away in the confusion. We ran blindly through twisting tunnels, the inhuman shrieks of the stalkers echoing behind us. Somehow, we ended up back near the entrance where the bus had dropped us off. And there it was, the Furno Express, just sitting there, as if waiting for us. "We gotta chance it," Teddy yelled. "It's our only way out of here." We sprinted for the bus. The door was open, but as we got close, a tall, pale figure stepped out. The driver. Its face was like a warped, elongated human visage, but its eyes, God, its eyes, pitch black and full of malevolent intelligence. It reached for us with unnaturally long arms. Teddy barreled into it, knocking the thing aside. "Go!" he shouted at me. "Get us the hell out of here." I didn't hesitate. I leapt into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. Teddy was right behind me. I gunned the engine, not even sure how I knew how to drive this thing. We tore out of there, the bus shuddering as it transitioned from that nightmarish realm back to our world. I kept driving, afraid to stop, until I recognized the outskirts of Frost Hollow. When I finally slowed to a stop, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn off the engine. I looked over at Teddy, but he was gone. Had he ever really been there at all? I stumbled out of the bus onto my street. Dawn was just breaking. I had been gone for days, but here it seemed like no time had passed at all. The bus was gone when I turned back to look at it. I was alone. I've tried to convince myself it was all just a vivid nightmare, but I know deep down it was real. Sometimes I still hear the rumble of that engine late at night, and I lie awake, terrified that one day the Furno Express will come for me again. I don't know why I was able to escape when so many others weren't. The guilt eats at me. I see Ian's face in my dreams, hear Jackie's scream. Whatever cosmic horror lurks out there in the dark spaces between worlds, I pray it never finds its way fully into ours, because if it does, God help us all. I've been an inspector for a real estate company for about 2 years now. It's usually a pretty boring job. I just go around checking on vacant properties, making sure everything's in order before they get listed. But what happened to me last week, I still can't wrap my head around it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do this job again. It was supposed to be a routine inspection of a foreclosed house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary. I pulled up to the address around 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was a plain 2-story house, white siding, detached garage. Looked like it had been empty for a while based on the overgrown lawn. I grabbed my clipboard and lockbox key and headed up to the front door. As soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy and stale, like the house had been sealed up for years. But that wasn't too unusual for a foreclosure. I started my usual walkthrough, checking for any damage or maintenance issues. The living room looked normal enough at first glance. Beige carpet, blank walls. But then I noticed an old wooden rocking horse in the corner. It was the kind you'd see in an antique shop, ornately carved with a worn leather saddle. Definitely not something you'd expect to find left behind in a foreclosure. I made a note to have it removed. I continued on to the kitchen, which was empty except for the usual built-in appliances. As I was checking the sink for leaks, I heard a soft creaking sound coming from the living room. I figured it was just the house settling, but when I poked my head back in, I froze. The rocking horse was slowly swaying back and forth. There wasn't any breeze, no open windows, just gently rocking on its own. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the floorboards were uneven. I hurried upstairs to finish the inspection as quickly as possible. The bedrooms were empty, nothing out of the ordinary. I was starting to calm down a bit. Then I got to the last bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was closed. As soon as I turned the knob, I felt a blast of cold air hit my face. The room was freezing compared to the rest of the house, and the first thing I saw when I opened the door was an old tube TV sitting on the floor against the far wall. It was one of those massive wooden console TVs from the 70s. The screen was cracked, and there were strange marks etched into the glass, symbols or writing I didn't recognize. But the weirdest part was that it was plugged in and on, showing nothing but gray static. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it, a quiet sobbing coming from the corner of the room behind me. I spun around, and my blood ran cold. Huddled in the corner was a man, completely naked, curled up in a ball. His skin was pale and covered in cuts and bruises. He was rocking back and forth, softly crying. Then he slowly raised his head and looked right at me. His eyes were wide and crazed, and he started laughing. It was this horrible, unhinged cackle that made my skin crawl, laughing and crying at the same time. I ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. I flew down the stairs and out the front door, not even bothering to lock up. I jumped in my car and peeled out of there, my hands shaking as I tried to dial 911. I blurted out what happened to the dispatcher between panicked breaths. They said they were sending officers right away. I sat in my car down the street, heart pounding, as I watched several police cruisers pull up to the house. The officers went inside with guns drawn. After what felt like an eternity, they came back out and approached my car. They told me they had searched the entire house and found nothing, no TV, no rocking horse, and definitely no injured naked man. The house was completely empty. I insisted that they check again, that I knew what I had seen. But they just looked at me like I was crazy. One of them asked if I had been drinking or taking any drugs. I was furious and terrified at the same time. I knew I wasn't imagining things. In a daze, I drove straight to my office to talk to my boss, Willie. He's been in the business for over 30 years, and I hoped he might have some explanation. When I finished telling him what happened, he just sat there silently for a long moment, his face pale. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You found the hollow house." Willie went on to explain that early in his career, he had a similar experience in a vacant house. Same rocking horse, same TV, same man in the corner. But it wasn't the same house. It was in a completely different city, hundreds of miles away. He said there were stories passed down among property inspectors about this phenomenon they called the hollow house, a house that seemed to appear in different locations over the years, always with the same bizarre elements inside, always terrifying the poor inspector who stumbled upon it. Willie had hoped it was just an urban legend, but now he knew it was real. He told me not to worry, that he would handle any further inspections of that property himself. I was immensely relieved, but also concerned for Willie's safety. He assured me he knew what he was doing. For the next few days, I tried to go about my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I kept replaying the events in my mind, questioning my sanity. Every time I approached a house for an inspection, my hands would shake as I unlocked the door. Then yesterday, I got a call from the main office. Willie hadn't shown up for work in 2 days and wasn't answering his phone. They wanted to know if I had heard from him. My heart sank. I knew immediately what must have happened. I drove out to that house again, my palms sweating as I gripped the steering wheel. But when I got to the address, my jaw dropped. The house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. It was like the house had never existed. I've spent the last 24 hours trying to make sense of all this. I've scoured the internet for any mention of the hollow house, but found nothing concrete, just vague forum posts and creepypasta stories that could easily be fiction. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened. All I know is that I can't bring myself to do this job anymore. The thought of walking into another empty house fills me with paralyzing fear. I'm writing this all down partly to try to process it, and partly in hopes that someone out there might have answers. Has anyone else encountered something like this? Am I going crazy? And what happened to Willie? I'm terrified that someday I'll turn on the news and see a report about an old man found wandering naked and injured, laughing and crying. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in a house again. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow in a corner, it all brings me right back to that room with the static-filled TV and the broken man huddled on the floor. I just want answers, but I'm afraid of what I might find if I keep digging. For now, all I can do is try to move on and hope that the hollow house stays far, far away from me. It all started about a month ago. I'm a junior detective with the local police department, still pretty green and eager to prove myself. I'd been working closely with Willie, one of our veteran officers, on a strange case involving an abandoned house on the edge of town. People had been reporting weird noises and lights coming from the place, even though it had been empty for years. Willie and I went to check it out one night. I won't go into the details of what we found there, but let's just say it shook us both to our cores. We left that house changed men, though Willie seemed far more affected than I was. In the days that followed, I noticed Willie acting off. He was jumpy, distracted, constantly looking over his shoulder. Dark circles formed under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd brush me off or change the subject. I figured he just needed some time to process what we'd seen. But as the days turned to weeks, Willie's behavior only got more erratic. He started missing shifts, which was completely out of character for him. His uniform was disheveled, his eyes wild and unfocused. The other officers whispered about him behind his back, speculating that he'd cracked under the pressure of the job. I knew better. I knew it had something to do with that house. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of this, I decided I had to check on him. I drove over to Willie's place after my shift ended, rehearsing what I'd say in my head. I'd offer to listen if he wanted to talk, or just sit with him in silence if that's what he needed. Whatever was going on, I wanted him to know he wasn't alone. I pulled up to Willie's small ranch house, immediately noticing how unkempt the yard looked. The grass was overgrown, and there were newspapers piled up on the front stoop. My stomach clenched with worry as I approached the door. I knocked and called out, "Willie, it's me. Just wanted to see how you're doing, man." No answer. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly pushed it open. "Willie," I called out again, stepping into the dim entryway. "You here?" The house was a disaster. Furniture overturned, papers strewn everywhere, dishes piled in the sink. It looked like Willie hadn't cleaned in weeks. A sour smell hung in the air, making me gag. I made my way through the living room, calling Willie's name. As I approached the hallway leading to the bedrooms, I heard a soft whimpering sound. "Willie?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. "That you, buddy?" I rounded the corner and froze. There, huddled in the far corner of the hall, was Willie. But he looked wrong. His skin was pale and waxy, his hair wild and matted. He was rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. "Willie," I said, approaching him slowly like I would a wounded animal. "It's me. What's going on?" He looked up at me then, and I had to stifle a gasp. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around wildly. But what really got me were the marks on his neck, dark, bruise-like imprints in the shape of fingertips, like someone or something had tried to choke him. "You shouldn't be here," Willie rasped, his voice hoarse and panicked. "You need to leave, now." I crouched down beside him, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm not going anywhere, Willie. Talk to me. What happened to you?" He shook his head violently. "Can't talk about it. He'll hear. He always hears." "Who, Willie? Who will hear?" Willie's eyes locked onto mine, filled with a terror I'd never seen before. "Nick," he whispered. "Old Nick. He found me, followed me home." I felt the blood drain from my face. Nick, that name meant something. It stirred a memory from that night in the abandoned house, something Willie had muttered in fear. But before I could chase that thought, Willie grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You have to go," he pleaded. "Before he comes back, please, just leave me alone." I tried to reason with him, to get him to come with me, but he became more and more agitated. Finally, fearing he might hurt himself in his panic, I backed off. "Okay, Willie," I said, holding up my hands. "I'm going, but I'm calling for help, all right? We're gonna get you some help." He just shook his head, curling in on himself again. I stepped out of the house, my hand shaking as I called it in. I requested a welfare check, emphasizing Willie's erratic behavior and the marks on his neck. As I waited for backup to arrive, I paced in Willie's overgrown yard, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Those marks on his neck, they weren't self-inflicted. Someone or something had hurt Willie. And whatever it was, he was terrified of it coming back. When the other officers arrived, I filled them in on what I'd found. They went in to check on Willie while I waited outside, still shaken by the encounter. To my shock, they emerged a few minutes later saying everything was fine. Willie was a bit disheveled, they said, but coherent and calm. No signs of any physical trauma. "But the marks on his neck," I sputtered, "and the state of the house." They looked at me like I was the crazy one. Said the house was a bit messy, sure, but nothing alarming. And Willie's neck was clear, no bruises or marks of any kind. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Had I imagined it all? But no, I knew what I'd seen. Something was very, very wrong here. As the other officers prepared to leave, assuring me Willie was fine and just needed some rest, I decided I had to take one last look. I had to prove to myself I wasn't going mad. I slipped around to the back of the house, peering in through the windows, and that's when I saw it. There, in Willie's spare room, was a rocking horse. But not just any rocking horse. This one was massive, easily big enough for an adult to sit on. Its wood was dark and twisted, its eyes glassy and lifeless, and carved into its side, in jagged letters that made my blood run cold, were the words, "Nick's best steed." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. That horse hadn't been there before, I was certain of it. And those words, Nick, old Nick, the name Willie had whispered in terror. I wanted to run back inside, to grab Willie and drag him out of that house. But as I stood there, frozen in indecision, I saw movement in the window. Willie appeared, staring out at me with those wild, terrified eyes. And behind him, just for a moment, I swear I saw a dark figure, tall and thin, with fingers like twigs reaching for Willie's throat. I blinked, and it was gone. But Willie remained, shaking his head slowly. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Leave me alone. I don't remember driving home that night. I just know I woke up the next morning, convinced it had all been some vivid, terrible nightmare. But when I got to the station, I learned the truth. Willie had vanished without a trace. We searched for weeks, combed every inch of his property, questioned neighbors, put out alerts. But it was like Willie had simply ceased to exist. The house stood empty, no sign of struggle or foul play. Even that monstrous rocking horse was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times since then. Could I have done something differently? Should I have forced Willie to come with me, kicking and screaming if necessary? The guilt eats at me constantly. But even worse than the guilt is the fear. Fear of what really happened to Willie. Fear of what might be out there, waiting in the shadows. And fear that one day I might look out my window and see a familiar rocking horse with those terrible words carved into its side. Nick's best steed. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened to Willie, but I know I'll never forget the terror in his eyes, or the chill that ran through me when I saw that rocking horse. Whatever took Willie, whatever old Nick really is, I pray I never have to face it myself. So that's my story. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know Willie is out there somewhere. Or maybe he isn't. Maybe he's become something else entirely, another steed in old Nick's stable. All I know is, I'll never look at a rocking horse the same way again. And I'll always wonder, late at night when the shadows grow long, if I'll hear the creaking of wood and the clip-clop of phantom hooves coming for me next. It all started when I saw a job listing for a night security guard at a storage facility on the outskirts of town. The pay was way above average for that kind of work, which should have been my first red flag, but I was desperate for a fresh start after leaving my old mall security gig, so I jumped at the opportunity without asking too many questions. When I arrived for my first shift, the sun was just starting to set. The storage facility was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. As I pulled up to the gate, my headlights illuminated deep, jagged scratches in the iron bars. They looked like claw marks from some massive animal. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to rationalize it away. Probably just vandals or something, right? I punched in the gate code I'd been given and drove through. The facility itself was a sprawling complex of identical gray buildings, all windowless and locked up tight. My instructions were to do periodic patrols throughout the night, checking for any signs of break-ins or suspicious activity. Simple enough. I parked by the small security office and went inside to clock in. That's when I noticed a crumpled piece of paper on the desk. I unfolded it to find a list of rules scrawled in messy, childlike handwriting. 1. Don't answer the basement door after midnight. 2. If you see a tall woman, tell her you haven't seen her brother. 3. Ignore the girl crying in the woods. 4. Don't look the smiling man in the eyes. 5. Leave before sunrise. I stared at the paper, my blood running cold. What the hell kind of place was this? Part of me wanted to walk out right then and there, but I needed this job, and I figured it was probably just some stupid prank by the day shift guys to scare the new guy. So I crumpled up the paper, tossed it in the trash, and started my first patrol. For the first couple hours, everything was quiet and normal. Just rows and rows of silent storage units. But as midnight approached, things started to get weird. It began with noises coming from the basement, rapid, skittering footsteps and scratching sounds. I tried the door, but it was locked. Probably just rats, I told myself. No big deal. Then around 1 a.m., I rounded a corner and came face to face with a woman. She was impossibly tall and rail-thin, with papery gray skin stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were pitch black and sunken into her skull. "Have you seen my brother?" she rasped in a voice like dry leaves. I froze, my mind racing. The note had said to tell her no. But in my panic I blurted out, I'm not sure. What does he look like?" The woman's face contorted in rage. Before I could react, she lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. Searing pain shot through my arm as she pressed her thumb into my skin. When she pulled away, I saw a glowing red pentagram burned into my flesh. I ran as fast as I could back to the security office and slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding. What the hell was happening? This couldn't be real, but it only got worse from there. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound of a little girl crying, coming from the woods beyond the fence. It was heartbreaking. She sounded so scared and alone. Every instinct told me to go help her, but remembering the note, I forced myself to stay put and cover my ears. The crying went on for what felt like hours. By the time it finally stopped, I was a nervous wreck. I decided to do one last patrol before locking myself in the office for the rest of the night. Big mistake. As I walked down a long corridor between storage units, I saw a figure at the far end. It was a man, but there was something horribly wrong with him. His limbs were too long, joints bent at unnatural angles, and his face, God, his face. His mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin that split his head nearly in half, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. He began walking towards me with a jerky, inhuman gait. I knew I shouldn't look in his eyes, but as he got closer, I couldn't help it. Our gazes locked, and in that moment, I saw things, horrible things, visions of blood and death and suffering beyond imagination. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but suddenly I heard a rooster crow in the distance. The sky was starting to lighten. The smiling man's face twisted in anger, and he retreated back into the shadows. I ran to my car and got the hell out of there, breaking every speed limit on the way home. I called my boss as soon as the office opened and quit on the spot. He seemed unsurprised, just said, "Figured as much," and hung up. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe someone had slipped something in my drink earlier that day. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Then last week, I saw a news story that chilled me to my core. Another security guard had gone missing from that same storage facility. The police found his abandoned car, but no trace of him. I don't know what that place really is, or what lives there, but I know it's evil. So let my story be a warning. If a job opportunity seems too good to be true, it probably is. And for the love of God, stay away from that storage facility. Some things are better left alone. It was around 2 a.m., and I was restocking the shelves with snacks when I heard a strange noise coming from the women's restroom. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other critter that had found its way inside. We often had problems with animals sneaking in through the vents. I grabbed the broom from behind the counter and cautiously made my way to investigate. As I approached the restroom door, I noticed water seeping out from underneath. That was odd. We hadn't had any plumbing issues recently. I knocked hesitantly. "Hello? Anyone in there?" No response. I tried the handle, but it was locked. That's when I saw it. Through the small gap between the door and the frame, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. A pale, emaciated face with sunken eyes was staring back at me. Long, dark hair clung to its wet skin. Before I could react, it disappeared from view. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing. What the hell was that? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a homeless person who had snuck in to use the facilities. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Gathering my courage, I called out again. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The restroom isn't for public use after hours." Silence. I waited a few moments, then fumbled for my keys. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The bathroom was empty. I stood there, dumbfounded. There was no way anyone could have left without me noticing. The only window was a tiny vent near the ceiling, far too small for a person to fit through. But the floor was covered in muddy footprints, bare feet with unnaturally long toes. They led from the toilet to the sink, then simply vanished. I backed out of the bathroom, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? Was I going crazy? I decided to check the security cameras. Maybe they had captured something I missed. As I rewound the footage, my confusion only grew. The cameras showed no one entering the bathroom all night. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., there was a burst of static across all the screens. When the picture cleared a few seconds later, that's when I heard the noise from the restroom. I sat there, staring at the monitors, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed movement on one of the screens. My blood turned to ice as I saw a figure dart across the parking lot. It was her, the thing from the bathroom. She moved with an unnatural, jerky gait, her long hair trailing behind her like a wet veil. Without thinking, I grabbed the phone to call the police. But as I dialed, I realized how insane this would sound. A wet ghost in the bathroom? They'd think I was on drugs. I hung up, unsure of what to do next. That's when the light started to flicker. At first, I thought it was just faulty wiring. But then I noticed a pattern. Short, short, long. Short, short, long. It was Morse code. SOS. I felt like I was losing my mind. Part of me wanted to run out of there and never look back. But another part, a part I'm not proud of, was curious. What was happening here? I decided to investigate further. Armed with only my cell phone flashlight, I made my way outside. The night was eerily still. No cars on the highway, not even the usual chorus of crickets and frogs from the nearby swamp. Just silence. As I swept my light across the parking lot, I saw them. Wet footprints leading away from the station, towards the tree line. Against my better judgment, I followed. The prints led me to a small clearing just beyond the trees. In the center was an old, crumbling well. It looked ancient, out of place in this modern setting. As I approached, I could hear a faint sound coming from deep within. It sounded like singing. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something off about it. It seemed to echo in impossible ways, as if it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the well, grabbing my wrist. I screamed and jerked back, falling to the ground. When I looked up, there she was. The creature from the bathroom was hovering over me, her hair hanging down like seaweed, dripping water onto my face. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, and she let out a shriek that seemed to shake the very air around us. I scrambled to my feet and ran faster than I ever have in my life. I didn't stop until I was back inside the gas station, the door locked behind me. I huddled behind the counter, shaking uncontrollably. What the hell was happening? Was this some kind of nightmare? I pinched myself, slapped my face, anything to wake up. But I wasn't dreaming. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I kept expecting her to appear at the windows, but she never did. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I quit that job the same day. I couldn't bring myself to go back, to face whatever was out there. For weeks after, I had terrible nightmares. I'd wake up gasping for air, feeling like I was drowning. Sometimes I swear I could smell damp earth and stagnant water in my room. I've tried to forget about that night, to convince myself it was just stress or lack of sleep playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Sometimes when it rains, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me with those hollow eyes. I've never told anyone this story before. Who would believe me? But I needed to get it off my chest, to share it with someone. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm not crazy after all. All I know is I'll never look at gas stations the same way again. And if you're ever driving down Highway 61 late at night and you see a small isolated gas station called Joe's Gas and Go, keep driving. Don't stop. You never know what might be waiting in the shadows. I'd only been working there for about a week. It was just a temporary gig to make some extra cash while I looked for something more permanent. The night shift was boring as hell most of the time. Just me alone in this dingy little convenience store attached to the gas station. Hardly any customers coming through. But that last night, God, I wish I had called in sick or something. It was around 2 a.m., and I was restocking the coolers, counting down the hours until my shift ended at 6. The fluorescent lights were buzzing, casting this sickly glow over everything. I remember feeling on edge for some reason, like something wasn't quite right. At first I tried to shake it off as just late-night jitters from too much coffee. But then I started hearing these weird noises coming from the back of the store. It sounded like dripping, like a leaky faucet or something, which was weird because I knew for a fact that all the sinks were working fine. I figured maybe it was just the ice machine acting up again, so I headed to the back to check it out. As I got closer to the restrooms, the dripping sound got louder. It was definitely coming from in there. I pushed open the door to the women's room, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescence flickered to life, and that's when I saw it. There was water absolutely everywhere, pooling on the floor, running down the walls. But it wasn't coming from any of the sinks or toilets. It was dripping from the ceiling. I looked up and nearly screamed. There was something clinging to the ceiling. At first I thought it was just some kind of huge water stain, but then it moved. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but all wrong. The limbs were too long, too thin. The skin looked slick and pale, almost translucent. And the face, oh God, the face. It didn't really have features, just these huge, bulging eyes staring directly at me. I was frozen in shock for what felt like an eternity, just staring at this thing as it clung to the ceiling, water dripping steadily from its body. Then suddenly its head twisted at an impossible angle, and those eyes locked onto mine. I've never felt terror like that before. It was primal, overwhelming. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The thing started to uncurl itself from the ceiling, moving in this jerky, unnatural way. Long fingers grasped at the tiles as it began to lower itself down. I could hear a soft, wet sound as its body peeled away from the surface. That finally snapped me out of my paralysis. I stumbled backwards, slamming into the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grasp the handle. I wrenched it open and bolted out of there as fast as I could. I ran straight out of the store, not even bothering to grab my stuff. I just had to get away. I sprinted across the parking lot to my car, fumbling with my keys. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified that thing was right behind me. As I peeled out of the lot, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. Something pale flashed in the darkness near the restroom windows. I floored it and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I called my boss the next day and quit on the spot. I told him some bullshit about a family emergency. There was no way in hell I was going back to that place to explain what really happened. I was afraid he'd think I was crazy or on drugs or something. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and paranoid. I couldn't sleep without nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like that thing was in my room, watching me with those horrible eyes. Even now, months later, I still get freaked out using public bathrooms. I'm always checking the ceilings, half expecting to see that creature lurking up there. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress or lack of sleep playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. That thing in the bathroom was no hallucination. I've done some research since then, trying to find any similar stories or explanations, but I haven't found anything concrete. Just vague urban legends and creepypastas that don't quite match up to what I experienced. Part of me wants answers, wants to know what that thing was and why it was there. But a bigger part of me is terrified to dig any deeper. What if looking into it somehow draws its attention again? What if it finds me? So I try my best to move on and forget. But some nights, when I'm lying in bed unable to sleep, I can still hear that soft dripping sound. And I wonder, was that really the only time that thing appeared? Or is it still there, lurking in that gas station bathroom, waiting for its next victim? I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened that night. The fear and trauma are etched into my mind. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that gas station again. And I hope to God that thing, whatever it was, stays confined to that cursed place and never finds its way out into the world. Sometimes I think about warning people, telling them to stay away from that gas station. But who would believe such an insane story? They'd probably just think I was some nut job making things up for attention. And honestly, a part of me hopes it was all in my head, because the alternative, that there really are monsters hiding in the dark corners of our world, is too terrifying to contemplate. So I keep the story to myself, bottled up inside. But I had to get it out somehow, even anonymously like this. Maybe writing it all down will help me process it and move on. Or maybe someone out there has experienced something similar and can shed some light on what I saw. All I know is that I'll never forget that night as long as I live. The image of that thing on the ceiling, those eyes boring into me, it's seared into my brain forever. I just hope that by sharing this, I can warn others to be careful. You never know what horrors might be lurking in the most mundane places, waiting to reveal themselves when you least expect it. So if you're ever driving late at night and need to stop at a gas station, maybe think twice before using the bathroom. You never know what might be waiting for you inside. And if you hear an unexplained dripping sound, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Don't look back. Don't try to rationalize it. Just get out of there before it's too late. I was lucky to escape with my sanity mostly intact. The next person might not be so fortunate. So please be careful out there. And whatever you do, stay away from that gas station on Route 17. Some places are just wrong, and that building definitely qualifies. I only hope that thing stays contained there and doesn't find its way out into the wider world. Because if it does, God help us all. I was restocking the snack shelves when my manager Mike asked me to check on a leak in the back storage room. "Just take a look and let me know if we need to call a plumber," he said before heading out for his smoke break. Simple enough, right? Wrong. As soon as I stepped into that dimly lit room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. The air was heavy and damp, with an odd metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. Water was trickling down one wall, leaving dark stains on the crumbling drywall. I moved some boxes out of the way to get a better look, and that's when I noticed it. A slight discoloration on the ceiling, right above where the leak seemed to be coming from. Heart pounding, I dragged over a rickety stepladder to investigate. As I ran my hand along the stained section of ceiling, a chunk of plaster crumbled away, revealing a small gap. Shining my phone's flashlight inside, I could just make out some kind of space beyond. What the hell? My curiosity got the better of me. I widened the hole, coughing as decades of dust rained down. And there it was, a hidden crawl space stretching off into darkness. I should have stopped right there, should have climbed down that ladder, told Mike what I'd found, and let professionals handle it. But some morbid fascination pushed me forward. I hoisted myself up into the gap, heart racing as I army crawled through cobwebs and debris. The beam of my flashlight revealed bare wooden beams and crumbling insulation. As I inched forward, the floorboards creaked ominously beneath me. That's when my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. A crude opening hacked into one wall, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Peering inside, I saw it opened into a small, windowless room. The musty smell was overwhelming now, mixed with something fouler that I couldn't place. My hands shaking, I shone the light around, revealing peeling wallpaper and water-stained floors. And there, in the center of the room, was a hole. Just a raw, jagged opening in the floorboards, maybe 3 feet across. Next to it stood an ancient wooden ladder, leading down into pitch blackness. I sat there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Who had built this? And more importantly, why? My mind raced with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Swallowing hard, I fished a coin out of my pocket and dropped it into the hole. 1 second passed, 2, 3. Then a faint, distant splash echoed up from the depths. Water. There was water down there. My skin crawled as I imagined how deep that shaft must go to take so long for the coin to hit. What could be lurking in those hidden depths? I knew I should leave, to get out of there and call the police. But some twisted part of me needed to know more. Holding my breath, I gingerly tested my weight on the first rung of the ladder. It creaked, but held firm. "This is insane," I muttered to myself as I began to climb down. The weak beam of my phone's flashlight barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. Each step sent vibrations through the ancient wood, and I prayed it wouldn't give way beneath me. I don't know how long I climbed. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The air grew colder, damper. That foul smell intensified, like mold and decay, and something I couldn't identify. Finally, my feet touched solid ground. I swept my light around, revealing rough stone walls glistening with moisture. I appeared to be in some kind of underground chamber. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of water. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I made out shapes in the murky water that covered the floor. Boxes, maybe? Old furniture? I sloshed forward for a closer look, and then I saw it. A pale, bloated hand breaking the surface of the water. I screamed, stumbling backward and nearly dropping my phone. My light flickered wildly as I spun around, revealing more horrific shapes beneath the inky surface. An arm here, the curve of a skull there. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. Panic overtook me. I splashed frantically back to the ladder, my sodden shoes slipping on the rungs as I scrambled upward. I didn't stop climbing until I burst out of that hellish hole, gasping for air. I don't remember how I got out of that hidden room or down from the crawl space. Everything's a blur until I found myself hunched over in the parking lot, retching onto the cracked asphalt. Mike found me there a few minutes later, shaking and babbling incoherently. He thought I was having some kind of breakdown and drove me to the ER. I couldn't bring myself to tell him or anyone else what I'd seen. Who would believe me? The police searched the gas station the next day, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No hidden rooms, no underground chamber, no bodies. They concluded I must have hallucinated the whole thing, probably from hitting my head or being overcome by fumes. But I know what I saw. Those images are seared into my brain forever. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the damp chill of that place, smelling that horrific stench. I quit my job at the gas station, of course. I can't even drive past it anymore without breaking into a cold sweat. But the nightmares follow me. The questions haunt me. Who created that hidden space? How many bodies were down there? And most terrifying of all, is whatever put them there still out there somewhere? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, most days I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced that day, and I'll never forget the horrors lurking beneath that ordinary gas station, or the feeling that I only scratched the surface of something far more sinister. So, if you're ever in an old building and notice something that seems off, a discolored patch of ceiling, an oddly placed wall, a draft where there shouldn't be one, my advice is to leave it alone. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some horrors, once seen, can never be unseen. I still lie awake at night, wondering what else might be hidden in the shadowy spaces between walls, beneath floorboards, under our very feet. The world suddenly seems so much darker, so much more dangerous, and I'm left with the gnawing fear that nowhere, not even the most mundane places, is truly safe. It started about 6 months ago when I got an unexpected email from someone named Teresa claiming to be from a company called Hatchet Biotechnica. At first I thought it was spam, but something about it caught my attention. The email mentioned that they were interested in my unique perceptual abilities and wanted to discuss a potential contract position. See, I've had this condition since I was a kid, where I see faces and patterns in everyday objects. Pareidolia, they call it. Most of the time it's harmless, seeing a face in a cloud or a tree trunk. But sometimes it gets intense, like the objects are alive and watching me. Doctors always told me it was just my brain playing tricks, nothing to worry about. Anyway, curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet with Teresa. She was a petite woman with piercing green eyes that seemed to look right through me. Over coffee, she explained that Hatchet was interested in using my gift to investigate certain locations of interest. They needed someone who could perceive things others couldn't. I was skeptical at first, but the pay was good, and honestly, I was intrigued. Teresa assured me the work was legit, just some routine inspections of properties the company was interested in acquiring, so I agreed to give it a shot. The first assignment seemed simple enough. Check out an abandoned house on the edge of town and report anything unusual. As soon as I stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt heavy and oppressive. My eyes were drawn to an old painting on the wall, a landscape scene that at first glance looked normal. But as I stared, I saw something move in the brush strokes. A face, with piercing blue eyes, watching me from within the paint. I blinked, and it was gone. I hurried out of there and gave Teresa my report. To my surprise, she didn't seem shocked. She just nodded and said, "Excellent work. We'll be in touch about the next assignment." That's when I started to realize this wasn't just some real estate gig. Over the next few months, I did dozens of these inspections for Hatchet. Houses, office buildings, even a few rural properties. Each time, I'd encounter something bizarre. Objects that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Strange symbols hidden in everyday patterns. Fleeting glimpses of impossible creatures. Teresa called these anomalies blues, manifestations that only someone like me could perceive. I started to piece together that Hatchet wasn't just identifying these locations. They were hunting something. Creatures that could disguise themselves as human, blending seamlessly into our world. My job was to sniff them out. It was my 33rd assignment when everything went to hell. A routine check of a suburban home. As soon as I walked in, I knew something was off. The air felt thick, almost syrupy. And everywhere I looked, I saw blues. Not the usual subtle clues, but blatant, impossible things. A vase of flowers where the blooms kept changing colors. A clock whose hands moved backwards. I tried to stay calm as I made my way through the house, taking mental notes. That's when I noticed the family photos on the mantel. At first glance, they looked normal, but as I stared, the faces began to shift and warp, and I realized with horror that I recognized them. They were members of the Hatchet team, people I'd worked with over the past months. My heart racing, I turned to leave, only to find Teresa standing in the doorway. But it wasn't Teresa, not really. Her face was wrong somehow, fluid, like it couldn't decide what shape to be. "You've done well," she said, her voice oddly distorted. "Better than we expected, but I'm afraid your services are no longer required." I ran. I don't remember how I got out of that house, but suddenly I was in my car, speeding away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house itself start to change shape, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. For days, I drove aimlessly, terrified to stop moving. I tried calling the Hatchet office, but the number was disconnected. The website was gone. It was like the entire company had never existed. I'm writing this now from a motel room somewhere in the Midwest. I don't know if they're still looking for me. I don't know if any of it was real or if I've finally lost my mind completely. But I feel like I need to warn people, to tell them to trust their instincts when something feels off, to really look at the world around them. Because sometimes the faces you see watching from the shadows are real, and they're wearing the faces of people you thought you knew. I don't know what happens next. Part of me wants to keep running forever, but another part thinks maybe I should use what I've learned, to keep looking for the blues, to try to understand what's really out there. All I know is I'll never see the world the same way again. If you're reading this, please be careful, be observant, and remember, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. That particular weekend, I set up my tent at the edge of the woods, maybe a quarter-mile from the house. It was a crisp October day, perfect camping weather. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood and just enjoying the peace and quiet. As the sun was starting to set, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw someone walking through the trees maybe 100 yards away. At first I thought it was just a neighbor out for a walk, but then I realized this person was definitely on my property. I called out, asking if they needed help, but they didn't respond. They just kept walking, weaving between the trees. I only caught glimpses as they moved through the shadowy forest. Something about their gait seemed off, like they were limping or dragging one leg. I felt a chill run down my spine. This didn't seem right. I debated packing up and heading back to the house, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just someone who had wandered off the nearby hiking trail by mistake. Still, I made sure my cell phone was fully charged and kept it close as night fell. I built a campfire and tried to relax, but I kept replaying that strange figure in my mind. As it got darker, the woods seemed to close in around me. Every snapping twig made me jump. I told myself to calm down. I'd camped out here dozens of times before without incident. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the lantern on outside the tent. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Footsteps crunching through the leaves, moving fast. They were coming straight for my campsite. My heart started racing. I lay completely still, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps circled my tent once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped right outside the entrance. I was frozen in terror. Long seconds ticked by in silence. Then, without warning, there was a loud slash, and something sharp cut through the side of my tent. I let out an involuntary yelp of fear. A hand reached through the tear, groping blindly. In the dim lantern light, I saw dirty fingernails and mottled skin. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and burst out the tent door, not even bothering with my shoes. I sprinted through the dark woods toward my house, branches whipping my face. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after me. Somehow I made it to the house and slammed the door behind me, locking it. I ran around, turning on all the lights, and grabbed my shotgun from the closet. For hours, I sat there shaking, jumping at every little sound. But nothing happened. When dawn finally came, I worked up the courage to look outside. There was no sign of anyone. I called the police, and they came out to investigate. They found my slashed tent and some footprints, but no other evidence. They told me it was probably just some drunk kids playing a prank, but I knew it was something much worse. For weeks afterward, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement at the tree line. Sometimes at night, I'd hear those same running footsteps circling my house. But whenever I looked outside, there was nothing there. I installed security cameras and motion-activated lights all around the property. For months, I barely slept. I kept replaying that night in my head, the slash of the knife, those grasping fingers reaching for me in the dark. Even now, a year later, I still don't feel safe in my own home. The scariest part is not knowing who it was or why they targeted me. Was it a deranged stranger, a neighbor with a grudge? I've gone over and over it in my mind, but I can't make sense of it. The police never found any leads. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll be outside at dusk and get that feeling of eyes watching me from the woods. I'll hear a twig snap in the darkness and my blood runs cold. Whatever, or whoever it was, I know they're still out there, and I'm terrified they'll come back to finish what they started that night. I don't camp on my property anymore. I barely even go in the backyard. I've thought about selling the place and moving, but part of me is afraid that thing would follow me wherever I go. So I stay and I wait, wondering if every night will be the night those footsteps come running out of the dark again. I know this probably sounds crazy. Most days I can almost convince myself it was all just a vivid nightmare. But then I'll catch a whiff of decaying leaves on the wind, and I'm right back there in that slashed tent with an unknown horror reaching for me in the night. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I'm sorry if this is rambling or doesn't make sense. I've never actually told anyone the full story before. It helps a little to get it out, but I still feel on edge. If anyone has experienced anything similar or has any insight, I'd appreciate hearing it. I just want to understand what happened to me and why. And I want to know if I'll ever be free of this lingering fear that something is still out there in the woods, waiting for me. For now, I keep the shotgun loaded by my bed. I check the security cameras obsessively, and every night before I go to sleep, I make sure every door and window is locked tight. But I can never shake the feeling that it won't be enough. That someday, somehow, that thing from the woods will find its way inside. And this time, there will be nowhere left to run. When I first arrived at the campsite, everything seemed peaceful. The lake was beautiful, partially frozen over and reflecting the gray winter sky. I set up my tent and got a small fire going, looking forward to a quiet evening in nature. That's when I first noticed him. There was a man, probably in his 40s, sitting by himself near a large pine tree about 50 feet from my campsite. He was bundled up in a thick, dark coat and just staring in my direction. I gave a little wave, trying to be friendly, but he didn't respond, just kept staring with this unsettling, blank expression. I tried to ignore him and go about setting up my camp, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Every time I glanced over, he was in the exact same position, unmoving. It was starting to seriously creep me out. As the afternoon wore on, I kept expecting him to set up his own tent or campsite, but he never did. He had no gear with him that I could see, just that coat. Who comes to a freezing cold campground in December with no supplies? I decided to try talking to him, thinking maybe he was lost or needed help. As I approached, he finally moved, turning his head to look directly at me. That's when I saw his face clearly for the first time, and my blood ran cold. He had this fake, plastered-on smile that didn't reach his eyes at all. His eyes looked exhausted, with dark circles underneath, and there was just something off about his whole expression, like someone trying and failing to mimic normal human emotions. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything okay? Do you need any help setting up camp?" He just kept smiling, that unnatural smile. "No," he said flatly. "I'm fine right here." His voice was as unsettling as his face, completely devoid of any warmth or normal inflection. I muttered something about letting me know if he needed anything, and retreated back to my tent as quickly as I could without running. My hands were shaking as I zipped myself inside. What the hell was wrong with that guy? Every instinct I had was screaming danger. I peeked out the tent flap, and he was still sitting there, still staring, still smiling that horrible smile. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just socially awkward or had some kind of mental health issue, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. As night started to fall, I realized I was going to have to leave my tent eventually to use the bathroom and put out my fire. The thought of walking around in the dark with that man out there made me feel physically ill. I kept an eye on him as long as I could in the fading daylight. He never moved from his spot, even as the temperature dropped further. Who sits motionless outside for hours in freezing weather? Finally, it got too dark to see him anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, which suddenly felt very inadequate, and quickly darted out to take care of things. My heart was pounding the whole time, expecting him to suddenly appear behind me. When I got back to the relative safety of my tent, I zipped it up tight and huddled in my sleeping bag, straining my ears for any sound of movement outside. I don't think I've ever felt so vulnerable and exposed. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me flinch. I must have eventually dozed off despite my fear, because I woke with a start sometime in the middle of the night. At first I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, the slow crunch of footsteps in the snow circling my tent. I held my breath, heart racing, as the footsteps made a complete circuit around me. They paused right outside the tent flap. I was terrified the zipper would start to open at any second. But after a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps moved away, heading off into the woods. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before letting out the breath I'd been holding. There was no way in hell I was going back to sleep after that. I lay awake the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound, clutching my knife with white knuckles. As soon as there was a hint of dawn, I burst out of my tent, looking wildly around. The man was gone. His spot by the tree was empty, with no sign he'd ever been there. No footprints, nothing. I've never packed up camp so fast in my life. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the tent poles apart. I kept spinning around, terrified he would suddenly appear from the woods. Just as I was shoving the last of my gear in my car, I noticed something on my windshield. It was a crude stick figure, drawn in the frost. Underneath was scratched a single word: soon. I peeled out of there so fast I'm surprised I didn't crash. I drove for hours, not even sure where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. It's been weeks now, and I still have nightmares about that man's dead eyes and fake smile. I keep expecting to see him outside my window or in my rearview mirror. I don't know who or what he was, but I know I escaped something truly evil that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just some crazy guy, that there's a logical explanation. But deep down, I know there was something much worse going on, something inhuman. I'll never go camping alone again. Hell, I can barely bring myself to go outside after dark anymore. I just keep waiting for him to make good on that promise of soon. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again.